Chapter 1. Crystal Lake Savings and Loan sat a little off the main road in a nice office park in Crystal Lake, Wisconsin. At noon on a Wednesday, traffic into and out of the bank was fairly constant. Workers on lunch came to cash and deposit checks, and the part-time employees switched out shifts. Mel watched it all through the rear-view mirror in a car parked half a block away. Mel straightened the collar of her shirt and checked the clock. Kathy Pearson was her target, and she needed to be inside before 12:30 or everything was fucked. On the bright side, this job didn't exactly stretch her skills. This was a small-town bank protecting small-town goods. But it meant that no one would look for Tina's safe deposit box here, especially since Mel suspected that it was a temporary arrangement. The scry crystal was the only item of Tina's that would be found in the bank, probably in this state. But Mel didn't need anything else from the witch, not anymore. Once she had the crystal, she would be well on her way to taking on the one person who had no place living anymore. Mel was playing the role of Helen Undine, a mediocre lawyer from Milwaukee looking for a taste of the simple life. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, no flyaways allowed. Her suit was 2 shades darker than beige and particularly unflattering, though expensive. She wore a small strand of pearls and a gaudy engagement ring. Helen was a complicated woman, and exactly what Mel needed at the moment. She wore flats, even though Helen would normally wear heels. But some things needed to be sacrificed for convenience, and running in a skirt suit would be difficult enough. She had no desire to trip over unnecessary inches. The inside of the bank did not give her the best impression of its security. A salesman's desk sat unoccupied in the lobby, and whoever sat there had left the computer logged into the bank's network. The security guard greeted her with a smile and only carried a taser, not a gun. 3 women sat at teller stations, though only one dealt with a customer. The other 2 were chatting and paying no attention to the entrance. She smiled when she saw Kathy Pearson walk across the room. The woman did a final check of the tellers 20 minutes before the end of her shift, and had been doing so each day that Mel cased the bank. Mel stepped forward quickly, clutching the briefcase, and bumped into the bank manager. "Oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry," said Kathy. She gave Mel a quick once-over, noting the jewelry and the fine leather of her case. "I didn't see you there. Is there anything I can help you with today?" "Perfect." Mel put just enough frustration into her stance and tilted up her nose before speaking. "Yes." She pursed her lips and kept her words clipped. "I need to access my safe deposit box. Are you someone who can handle that?" Condescension dripped from her tone. Kathy's neck tightened in frustration. Mel knew that, at this time of day, she was the only person authorized to take customers to the vault, and she was minutes away from going home. But she smiled and didn't even sound put out. "Of course, do you have your key with you? And I'll need to log your admission." She grabbed a clipboard from one of the tellers and handed it to Mel. Helen Undine had a beautiful, precise signature that matched her identification. Kathy led her back to the building and through a barred gate. The security guard entered the vault with them. Mel had opened the account 3 days before, and through some quick talking had been able to get the box adjacent to the one that she needed. The guard and Mel each put their keys in the lock and turned simultaneously. The guard pulled out the box and handed it to her. Mel gave a tight smile in thanks. She was led to a small chamber inside the vault where she would be given privacy to review the contents of the box and make any necessary deposits. Both Kathy and the guard waited behind a red curtain while she got down to business. Mel checked her watch. She'd been in the bank less than 10 minutes, and it was almost time to get to work. A scream rent the air. Right on time. Mel jerked from her chair and looked at Kathy and the guard. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Kathy straightened, assessing the situation. She was the only manager on duty at the moment. "I should go check. Will the 2 of you be all right while I'm gone?" "By all means," said Mel. "Obviously there are more important issues." Kathy didn't know how to take that, but she hurried off, leaving Mel and the guard alone. Mel started counting down from 120, which was when the next distraction would go off. She idly sorted through the contents of the box. There were papers and some cheap jewelry, nothing of any real value, but it looked like there was enough that it would take time to find what she needed. That was the important thing. Right on time, a blast rocked the air, followed by the hollow pop of firecrackers. Mel jerked, knocking over a few of her papers and gasping for effect. She stormed out from behind the curtain, bumping into the guard before she could stop herself. "What was that?" she demanded, a hint of panic creeping into her voice. The security guard's hand flew to his taser, and he looked towards the front of the bank. "It's all right, ma'am. You'll be safe here." He took off towards the commotion without further prompting. Great. Mel gave it a few seconds before opening her briefcase and pulling out the lockpicks. The guard had closed the inner door behind him, which gave her privacy and the freedom to work without looking over her shoulder. She went to box 109 and placed the guard's key in one of the key slots. She'd lifted it from him when they bumped into each other after the blast. Picking the other lock was easier than it should have been, and Mel had the safe deposit box containing her payment for the Scarlet Emerald job in her hand in under a minute. She opened the box and froze, not quite understanding what she saw. She closed the box and opened it once more, hoping that her eyes were deceiving her. There was no payment in the box. There was only a business card. In crisp letters, the business card said Luke Torres and listed a phone number and an email address. No business name, no physical address. But Mel knew exactly where he lived. After all, he was the one that she stole the Scarlet Emerald from. A month earlier, a witch named Tina Anders approached Mel about boosting the gem. It was a difficult job, one that only 3 people, including Mel, were capable of pulling off. But Tina and Mel had a long history, and Tina offered Mel a payment she couldn't refuse to pull off the job in a nearly impossible time frame. And she'd done it too, except for a small mishap that had made her the uninvited guest of the werelion Alpha for a few days. And that should have been it. She gave Tina her stone, Tina gave her the key to this safe deposit box, and business was concluded. Except for the vampires. When she explained the job, Tina said nothing about vampires. And if she had, Mel liked to think she would have refused the work outright, no matter the payment. But the vampires showed up, shit went to hell, Luke Torres accused her of kidnapping his sister, and Mel teleported away before he could tear her throat out. Which was good! Except for the part where she ended up naked 1,000 miles away, sans safe deposit box key and address. And that all ended up with Luke, in a pile of her clothes, in the forest back in Colorado. Only after she met back up with Krista was she reminded that a person using a teleportation charm needed to own the things they wished to teleport. Mel's clothes had been procured through other means. So while she did own the key and the card with the address fair and square, she didn't own the clothes that had held them. Krista and Bob had both taken off after taking their payments for their parts of the job, and she was left with nothing. And Luke had everything. Most importantly, he had her scry stone. Mel slammed the box shut and jammed it back into the correct slot. She bit her lip to keep from cursing. A scry stone would allow her to locate the stone's focus with the help of a witch. She'd have a magical GPS to find her target at any time, and this scry stone was more valuable than anything she owned. The scry stone was linked to a witch named Ava. It would let her track down the woman who had killed her parents. Mel straightened and sat back at the table, waiting for Kathy or the guard to return. Already a plan was forming in her mind. It was simple enough. She was just going to have to steal from the Alpha one more time. Chapter 2. The lion roared. The sound shuddered through the forest outside of Eagle Creek, Colorado, where the lions of his pack prowled in search of his missing sister. Mel's timing could have been better, but she hadn't known that the night she arrived back in town would be the same night he sent out his troops to find the lost lion cub. Her heart pounded and exhilaration flowed through her with every snap of a twig. She was just one wrong move away from being imprisoned by the Alpha once more. And this time she didn't have a witch to get her out of danger. She didn't know if they were all out to find Cassie, but she couldn't imagine any other reason for them to be out there. The lions weren't a hunting party out for blood. She could hear the murmur of their words, the surety of their steps. They were tearing the forest apart methodically, covering every inch in search of the kidnapped teenage girl. But other than the wind and the intermittent sounds of were-animals on the prowl, Mel heard nothing else. The nocturnal animals that usually used these woods had gone into hiding. Even the insects were silent. She blew away a stray strand of hair and then tucked it behind her ear when it landed in front of her eye once more. The first time she'd come to Eagle Creek, she'd been a redhead, or at least she had looked that way. The wig was part of one of her identities and offered a distraction to anyone who tried to remember what she looked like. Tonight there were no distractions. She wore tight, dark clothing that moved with her like a second skin, and she had her brown hair pulled back into a ponytail. On other jobs like this one, she might have worn a mask. But she didn't need to hide her identity from the Alpha. He knew she was coming. Hell, he had invited her. She'd headed straight for Colorado after she finished in Wisconsin. The only pit stop involved an overnight stay in St. Louis to pick up some supplies from a witch that she'd worked with before. For a second she'd considered calling Krista, but she threw the thought away almost as quickly as it came. Her old partners had made it abundantly clear that they were done with her. Mel deserved it, and she just wished that she didn't. But screwing over partners had consequences that she couldn't avoid. She just had to live through them, and hope that one day Krista would forgive her. The witch was the closest thing to family that Mel had left. But she couldn't get caught up in that. One wrong move and it was back to the Alpha's compound, and that wasn't a game she wanted to play. The sound of a broken twig was her only warning. Mel reacted, ducking behind a huge tree and keeping absolutely still when two lions walked into the tiny clearing that she'd been moving through. She heard two people enter the clearing, and they couldn't be anything other than shifters. Mel took one deep breath and let it out as slowly as possible, resorting to shallow, near-silent gulps of air as they moved closer. She heard a man say, "Hold up, there's something different here." And she felt sweat bead on the back of her neck. Mel wasn't breathing deep enough to draw in their scents, and they hadn't been in the area long enough for them to permeate every breath. But she'd been there for several minutes, and they weren't hampered by shallow breathing. "What is it?" said the woman. "I think I caught Cassie's scent." The man had a hint of New England in his voice, and Mel could almost imagine what he looked like. He'd be tall, short hair that might have been blonde, and a jaw strong enough to lift concrete slabs. Or not. She couldn't risk ducking around the tree to be sure. The woman was pure Georgia South, her words a mix of peaches and honey. "Are you sure? There's something here, but I can't tell." "It's not one of us." The man's words were certain. She heard him stepping closer. Mel only had seconds before he stepped around and discovered her. She concentrated, feeling her hands turn into leopard's paws, her claws extending. Her only advantage would be surprise, and she would try only to incapacitate, not kill. She had no reason to make the Alpha angrier than he already was. "Wait," said the woman. "I think I've got a trail over here." The man's footsteps paused, and then he headed in the opposite direction. Both lions walked away, following the trail she'd left coming into these woods. She was damn lucky, and she wasn't going to risk being caught like that again. She had to get out of these woods and back to her hotel. She could reconfigure her plans then. Mel took to the trees to get out of the woods. Her claws helped her, allowing her to dig into the bark and hoist herself onto sturdy branches. She jumped from tree to tree, traveling slowly but leaving a much more discreet scent trail. She froze when she heard another roar, this one unlike the first. The first lion's roar had been full of rage and regret, the call of an animal determined to have his revenge. This one was joyous. Cassie had been found, alive. Mel didn't let that stop her. She made it miles and miles away to the small parking lot in the national park, close to the edge of Luke's territory. She sat on a large branch and waited for a few minutes to turn her paws back into human hands. It wasn't a difficult task, but it took time, and as she shifted slowly, every joint in her fingers ached in protest at the task she'd put them through, climbing through dozens of trees in a form unsuited to the task. She was ready to jump from her tree when a young woman walked out of the woods on a scenic path of the national park. She looked younger than Mel, maybe in her early 20s, with long black hair and pale skin. She wore jeans, a silky blouse, and hiking boots. On her wrist, Mel could see the glint of silver, perhaps from a watch or a bracelet. It was strange for a woman to be alone in the woods at night. Even Mel was only there for her own nefarious purposes. She was instantly suspicious of the woman, even more so when she pulled out a cell phone and held it to her ear. Mel had to focus to hear, but she could make out the words clearly. "Let her know it was a success. The girl has been reunited." Mel would have frozen in place if she hadn't already been still. The woman spoke again. "I'll need to reorder supplies from a local coven. Vladimir underestimated my needs." "I understand. I'll be on the lookout." She hung up without a farewell. Mel stayed in her tree until the woman drove away in a silver sedan. From the plates, she could tell it was a rental. It appeared that Cassie hadn't been found. She'd been given back. But what use did witches have for a werelion that couldn't even shift? And why would one need additional supplies? Mel tried not to let it bother her. She climbed down from her tree and got into the rusty old pickup that she'd stolen halfway between Colorado and Wisconsin. She crossed off this parking lot as a point of entry for her next heist and planned to get a new car out in Denver where she was staying. It was a 2-hour drive back to that city. Mel let the miles pass alone on the road with her thoughts. After half an hour of struggling, she turned up the radio and sang along with a popular country song she'd heard nearly every hour as she tried to find clear stations. The distraction didn't work, but she made it all the way to Denver without deciding to go find out what the witches wanted. Maya had gotten that tip about Cassie an hour ago. It took Luke 20 minutes to mobilize the search party, and another dozen minutes for his people to pour through the woods. He let out an enraged roar, desperate to find his sister and bring her back home. She'd already been gone for too long, but he would not lose her. The sound ripped out of his human mouth, battering against his vocal cords and leaving pain in its wake. He didn't care. There was no pain too great, no task too big that would prevent him from finding Cassie. He found her scent and latched on, following it through trails that didn't exist, vaulting over downed branches and crashing through the brush. His search wasn't silent. He'd scared away the normal inhabitants of the forest by bringing all of his own predators along for the ride. They'd all split up, searching the woods in groups of 2s and 3s. He alone traveled with 4 other lions. They would not leave their leader vulnerable in what could very well be a trap. But Maya trusted her source, and Luke trusted Maya. They were going to find Cassie, safe and sound. The forest terminated abruptly, opening into a wide clearing. Luke spotted Cassie moving in the middle of a ring of mushrooms only 50 feet away. He let out another roar, this one ragged and joyful, and ran across the clearing, tromping on the mushrooms and gathering his sister into his arms. Cassie would have hugged him back, but her hands were held together with silver handcuffs and her feet were bound with ropes. She dug her face into the crook of his neck and he could feel her tears against his skin. "I was so scared," she said. "Thank you." She sobbed out the words, almost out of breath from the strength of his hug. Luke patted down her hair. It was a mass of blonde knots with a few leaves stuck in for good measure, almost like she'd been in the forest for longer than the few hours that Maya's informant had said she had been. "We've got you." He kissed her forehead and pulled back to try and remove her restraints. He heard 2 more of his lions enter the clearing while he worked. He had to pull back swiftly after one touch of the cuffs. The silver content was so high that he could already feel his fingers itch in reaction. He'd always had a low silver tolerance, but it usually took at least a few moments for an allergic reaction to kick in. "I need a key to these cuffs," he demanded and moved to untie Cassie's legs. She held still, and since it was normal, if thick rope, he was able to free her in no time. "This isn't the same, I told you," said Javier, one of the lions who'd volunteered to search on short notice. He wasn't a tracker and had never hunted down a person before. But Luke needed all hands on deck. His partner for the night, Alicia, replied, "We probably covered someone else's ground." She left Javier and approached Luke. Alicia had only moved into his territory 3 months before, formerly working at the CDC in Atlanta until she received a job offer too good to pass up in Denver. She didn't live within pack territory, but that hadn't stopped her from quickly joining and becoming an important member of the pack. Javier, on the other hand, had been born and raised in Eagle Creek and owned a small accounting firm that handled the money of several local businesses. They were the first 2 to join Luke and his entourage in this clearing. The rest of the pack slowly trickled in. Mick, a boy recently in trouble for general rowdiness and for failure in his guard duty, quickly picked the locks of Cassie's restraints. For the moment, Luke was happy the boy had the skill, but he made a mental note to figure out why kids in his pack were learning how to break into things. There had been enough thievery for one lifetime. Ensuring that Cassie wasn't booby-trapped and that there were no other nasty surprises in the clearing, Luke helped Cassie up, and they made it over to where he'd parked his car to take her back home. He expected Cassie to sleep after taking a shower, but his younger sister called him into her room to talk while she was busy drying off her hair. Now that she was no longer covered in smudges of dirt and grass, he could see black and brown bruises covering her pale skin. Violence roared within him, and he wanted to run, to hunt down whoever had done that to her. But he was thankful that her only injuries seemed to be superficial. No broken bones, nothing worse. At least she hadn't said anything.
"How are you doing?"
he asked. He sat down in the reading chair and propped his feet on the foot of her bed. The room was large, with 2 chairs, a writing desk, and a reading nook built in by the window. It was the guest room Luke used for his family, and it was only 2 doors down from his own. Cassie sat on the bed, her back resting on the headboard. "Bumped and bruised, but I'm okay." She combed her fingers through her hair gently while she talked. "I'm so sorry. I screwed up. I shouldn't have done it, please." Tears prickled at her eyes. "I know I was wrong." Luke held up a hand.
"We'll talk about all that later."
He fully intended to. He knew that anger would lick at his heels once he was certain that his sister was safe. Even now, with her back in her room, he couldn't quite believe it. But come morning, he expected to be in full form. She didn't need that tonight. But she wasn't ready to stop talking. "Did you tell Mom and Dad?" He didn't think she could sound any more apologetic. And it was Luke's turn to hesitate. His mother and stepfather had been on vacation when Cassie disappeared, and he hadn't even thought to contact them until 2 days later. As alpha of his territory, looking out for his people was his job. He couldn't go crying to his parents whenever something went wrong. So he had stalled and stalled.
"Not yet,"
he finally said.
"I knew that I would find you."
Cassie narrowed her eyes but didn't ask for more reasons. "So maybe they don't have to know?"
"We'll talk about that later."
His sister let it drop. She changed the subject. "There were 2 vampires that took me, though I only saw one after that first night. After that they—" She cut off and furrowed her brow. After a moment, she continued, as if she didn't remember pausing. "I can't remember how I got to the clearing, but I know you were coming for me." She smiled and leaned further back, perhaps relaxing for the first time since she'd entered his house that night. But she sat back up and stiffened.
"What's wrong?"
Luke asked. Cassie shook her head. "I don't know. My back must be bruised or something." Luke stood.
"Can I take a look?"
He didn't have medical training, but he thought he could tell the difference between something minor and something severe.
"Or I can have Kenny come take a look. She's a paramedic."
Cassie lay down on her stomach. "Sure, take a look." She hiked up her shirt to reveal a mass of bruises centered around her spine. The ugly purple, black, and blue covered her back. Luke had no idea how she hadn't noticed it until this moment. He gently pressed his hand down on the bruised flesh.
"Does this hurt?"
he asked. Cassie's voice was muffled by the blanket. "Like it's bruised," she answered.
"I've got some ointment that should help."
He left her alone for a moment to grab the bottle from his bathroom, but he'd only stepped into the hallway when the hackles on the back of his neck rose. He turned around and stormed right back into Cassie's room. His thief, the woman who'd stolen the Scarlet Emerald right from his vault, stood over his sister, one hand hovering over Cassie's back.
"What the hell are you doing here?"
he snapped. Chapter 3. It was a good question. Mel had made it to her hotel before the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach forced her to turn around and break every speed limit to get back to Luke's house. Witches didn't play nice. They didn't let their captives free, not as easily as they let Cassie go. And once she saw Cassie's back, things started to become clearer. She froze when the Alpha entered the room. It had only been a week since they'd last seen each other, but somehow she'd forgotten exactly what it felt like to stand next to him. Luke Torres took up all the space in the room when he was mad. He wasn't as hugely muscular as some men. His build was more compact, lithe. But he was taller than Mel and exuded the confidence of a man who ruled over people who respected him. He had brown hair long enough that Mel had to clench her fists to stop the compulsion of running her fingers through it, and dark brown eyes that locked her in place. In the yellow light of Cassie's room, his skin looked magically dark gold, though during the day it would be a more normal light brown. Mel didn't know why she felt so drawn to him. She'd been around plenty of powerful men and women in her life, and never had she felt the urge to be near them, or to do wicked things with them. But Luke brought out something in her, something that called her to help when she knew he was being threatened by a force he couldn't understand. But she didn't answer his question. It was his sister who needed her attention. "Do you know who did this to you, Cassie?" The blonde girl looked over her shoulder, confused. "One of the vampires, I guess." Mel studied the scrolling dark lines weaving over the ridges of Cassie's spine. She traced a finger over the hex. No, this wasn't the work of a vampire. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, shoving her away from the teenager and against the wall. Luke put his forearm over her throat to hold her in place.
"What the hell are you doing here?"
he demanded. Speaking around the vise of his arm proved difficult, but Mel made the effort. "Can't you see that no vampire did that?" She pushed against him, but he didn't budge. She didn't expect him to.
"Your concern for my sister's injury is appreciated, but you have no right to be here."
He crushed his arm harder against her and spoke inches from her face. It was Mel's turn to be confused. Even with no experience with witches, how could they be stupid enough to think vampires could hex a girl? Mel let herself go limp, waiting for Luke to lower his guard just enough. When he did, she looped her ankle around his knee, kicking at the awkward angle and causing him to buckle forward. She jumped to the side and hopped to the other side of Cassie's bed, putting the girl between the two of them. Luke wouldn't risk hurting his sister. But Mel had to talk fast before he recovered enough to avoid the girl. "This is a hex. I saw a witch in the forest. Something is fishy about this, and I came to warn you." That gave the alpha pause.
"What would a witch want with my sister?"
Cassie watched the back and forth, remaining silent. Mel didn't know the answer, but she needed some of her own. "Why did you think that this was a bruise? It's clearly magic." She waved her hand over the girl's back without touching her. Luke took 2 steps closer, but he didn't move to hurt Mel again. Progress.
"I know what a fucking bruise looks like. There's nothing magic here."
He jerked his head up, and he met her eyes.
"How do you know so much about magic?"
It was a valid question, and one Mel hadn't meant to answer. Shapeshifters customarily kept their distance from witches. Centuries of conflict made collaboration a difficult prospect. And Mel's situation was stickier than most. "I've worked with witches," she finally said. "It's a requirement in my line of work." His shoulders tensed and she knew she shouldn't have mentioned the theft. But all ground was shaky when it came to dealing with Luke.
"Why should I believe you?"
He couldn't have sounded more doubtful if he tried, but clearly something was keeping him from springing on her and locking her back up in the cell in his basement. "Because—" The door flew open before Mel could finish speaking, and Maya Nunez, Luke's second-in-command, burst in, pointing a gun at Mel's face. The woman seemed older than Luke, though Luke was only in his 30s, and most of their kind were older than him. She had bright red hair that she must have dyed constantly to maintain the vivid color. That hair brought out the red undertones in her brown skin and made her seem lit with an inner fire. The other woman didn't take a shot. Seeing that Luke stood coiled to strike but unmoving, and that Cassie lay peacefully on the bed, she lowered her gun. Mel knew not to make any sudden movements. Luke might have been the strongest person in the room, but one look in Maya's eyes, and Mel knew that she was the deadliest. "Are you all right?" she asked Luke, not taking her eyes off Mel. Her voice held the faintest trace of an accent, though Mel couldn't identify it. Luke looked at Maya and seemed to come to a decision.
"Is there anything strange about Cassie's back?"
he asked. Maya didn't question the request. She approached the girl and examined her exposed back. "She's been bruised, probably slammed against a wall based on the pattern. I'd guess this happened at least 2 days ago from the coloring." Maya looked at Mel. "So why are you here?" Mel had to keep from gnashing her teeth, but it made a certain kind of sense that no one but her could see the hex. The more specific magic was, the more power it had. Mel pulled her phone out of her pocket and snapped a picture of the design on Cassie's spine. She tossed the phone to Luke. "Now do you see it?" she asked. She didn't know if it would work, but if it didn't, she was out of ideas. The color drained from Luke's face. Cassie finally sat up. She adjusted her shirt to cover herself and approached her brother. "What is it?" Luke handed the phone to his sister and looked over at Mel.
"How?"
Mel shrugged. But while speaking to Luke, she saw Maya shift on her feet. She spoke slowly, swinging her head to the side to make sure the window was in view. "You've caught the attention of a coven." Maya sprang at her, but Mel was already moving, diving out the third-story window and rolling when she hit the grass below. It hurt like hell, but she couldn't let that slow her down. She sprinted for her life, hoping that Luke called Maya off before they unleashed the proverbial hounds. She didn't let herself believe that she was safe until she was halfway to Denver once more. Maya had her gun out before Luke even realized that Mel was out the open window.
"Let her go,"
he told his security chief.
"She'll be back, I'm sure."
Cassie studied the picture on the phone. Luke couldn't quite believe it himself. When he looked at Cassie's back, it was clearly covered in regular bruises. But when he looked at the picture that Mel had just taken, he saw the darkly lined scroll work which weaved its way over every visible part of her spine. "It doesn't hurt," said Cassie. "It looks like a tattoo, but it doesn't hurt like one."
"You have a tattoo?"
It wasn't the most important thing, but a big brother liked to know about what was going on in his little sister's life. Cassie rightfully hit him in the shoulder and stuck out her tongue. Maya holstered her gun and shut the window, closing the curtain as well. "Your thief is hiding more than we thought." And wasn't that the truth? Luke knew she was coming. How could she resist when he'd put his own business card and stolen her pretty necklace right out of her safe deposit box? But seeing her in his house once more, standing right over his sister, that had been a surprise. The first time they'd met, he had been caught by the sight of her hair, bright red, coming down in perfect waves, as eye-catching as neon. Of course, that was a wig, but what was underneath was so much more interesting. Not her hair, which was naturally brown, but the woman herself. He'd become entangled with a thief.
"Are you surprised?"
he asked Maya. "If she pulls a rabbit out of her hat, I'm done." Maya threw her hands up. The warning wasn't necessary. Shapeshifters couldn't create magic. Witches couldn't change shape. Some things were constant in the world, and Luke didn't expect that one to change. Luke turned to his sister.
"Do you remember this happening? Who did this to you?"
With proof of magical involvement in front of him, he had to act.
"Do you know how you got to that forest?"
"You think I'm like a Trojan horse or something?" asked Cassie. She wasn't looking at either of them. Instead, her finger traced above the pattern immortalized in Mel's phone. Her voice was hollow. "I should remember this. It had to hurt. It does hurt a little. But I only ever saw vampires." Luke drew his sister into a hug, holding her tightly against him and resting his cheek against her blonde temple. She was nearly as tall as him, but it didn't mean he couldn't comfort her. He pulled the phone from her hands and handed it over her shoulder to Maya.
"See what you can grab about Mel, and see if there's anything on the hex."
Maya nodded and left the siblings alone. Cassie sniffed and backed away, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I thought it was going to be over." So had Luke, but some things were just too convenient to work out that way.
"How did you end up in the forest? Any idea?"
The tip had come quickly. Maya had been so sure that Luke hadn't questioned it, and now it seemed that he should have. Cassie sat back down, this time in one of the chairs. She rested her elbows on her legs and her head in her hands. "There was a house after... No." She smacked a hand down and let out an anguished breath. "Let me start from the beginning." But she wouldn't look at him when she spoke. Luke nodded. He wouldn't let himself be angry at her. Not yet. Not until she was okay. "Okay, I was in the cell downstairs with Mel." Cassie glanced over to see if he would say anything, and Luke didn't interrupt to ask why. He was very proud of himself for that and tried not to let it show. "She tied me up in the bathroom, lectured me about being stupid, and took off. And then I was down there for a while, but it couldn't have been too long because Mick would have woken up. Maybe 20 minutes? She twisted her fingers together and remembered to breathe. "And then I heard footsteps, fast and not nearly as graceful as anyone in your pack. So I stayed really quiet, but they found me. 2 vampires. They untied me, threw something in my face, and got me out of the house. I don't remember it very well. It was all fuzzy, almost like I was super drunk." She cut herself off and smiled at Luke.
Luke had to laugh. I'm completely shocked that my 18-year-old sister has consumed alcohol. Please continue.
Anyway, I was loopy. I don't remember if Mick was still in the hallway or not, and I blacked out once we were in the car. I woke up in a small house. I could see the mountains from my window. It was on the 3rd story, so I couldn't jump out. And then... Cassie's eyes went distant, and she slumped to the side of the chair. Luke rushed over, heart racing. He shook her shoulders, calling her name.
And I woke up in the forest, all tied up. She straightened in the chair and met his eyes. When did you get over here? She looked between the far side of the room and Luke. You're fast, but not that fast. Icy terror flooded Luke, and he did his best to keep his expression neutral while he spoke. He didn't want Cassie to be afraid. To be more afraid, anyway.
You passed out. Do you remember that?
Cassie paled. No, I don't know what you're talking about. Luke grabbed her hand and gave it a quick squeeze.
It's okay. We'll get this figured out.
He knew just who to call for assistance. Chapter 4. Mel didn't know how to make her next move. She had no way to enter Luke's property without being caught, and he had no reason to put her scrystone in a vulnerable enough position for her to be able to steal it. She stayed up the entire night trying to figure out a way to get into his fortress, but there was nothing she could do alone. Sometime just before the sun crested the horizon, she fell asleep. Sometime later, a sound in her room woke her up. Mel remained perfectly still, not even opening her eyes. Any movement would alert her intruder. She breathed deeply and relaxed. The scent that permeated the room was one of comfort, of sexiness, and of home, just like she remembered Luke. Her eyes snapped open, and she rolled to the side before he could pin her to the bed. In a fluid motion, she went backwards over the edge and landed on her feet, spry and ready to spring into action if he wanted a fight. The alpha smiled, white teeth shining in the dark room.
Good morning, thief.
Mel was on the balls of her feet, but she didn't run. Instinct had kept her alive in dangerous situations for more than 30 years, and she wasn't going to start ignoring it now, even when logic told her it would be wise to run from the alpha that couldn't want anything good from her. Not after all the shit she pulled. Logic said that. Instinct told her to smile. Good morning, Alpha. She didn't let the fact that he was in her room, that she was in her pajamas, or that he'd tracked her down intimidate her. She didn't have time to be intimidated. You've come a long way for a house call.
I have your phone. Didn't have a way to call you.
He was waiting for her to run. She could see it in the minute shifting of his feet, the way he kept watching for the smallest twitch in her hips to see if she would move. Of course, that explained how he found her so quickly. Mel hadn't expected to give the phone up, and she hadn't bothered to clear the search history on the GPS program. Hell, for that rookie mistake, she deserved to be caught. So what do you want? Mel reached over and turned on the bedside light. The small shaft of sunshine peeking through the blackout curtains wasn't nearly enough to conduct business by. Satisfied that she wasn't going to immediately run, Luke leaned on the door, arms crossed. Mel didn't know if he was purposefully showing off his muscular arms or not, but she appreciated the view nonetheless. With the light on, it didn't look like he had gotten any sleep. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, and there was a ragged hollowness to his cheeks. But Mel wouldn't let herself feel compassion. Not now. Not for him. He was surely about to screw her over.
You knew about the hex,
he said. His voice didn't betray his obvious fatigue. He must have had plenty of practice.
You knew about it within seconds of seeing it.
Mel hoped he wasn't going to be stupid enough to accuse her of practicing magic. It would be a pity to lose all respect for him so quickly. Not that she was starting to respect him or anything.
So you must have seen something like that before, he finished. And judging by your reaction to it, I think you know it's bad.
Smart man. Dangerous, sexy, smart man. Mel didn't want to reveal her entire sob story. Besides, he knew enough of it already. But if she wasn't careful, he would cut to the heart of the matter just from her reactions. No wonder this man was an alpha at such a young age. How old are you? She didn't mean to ask. The research Krista had put together gave her an idea, but still, she was curious. And for some reason, Luke obliged.
32. You?
The same.
There were a dozen reasons to lie, none of them good.
And besides, he probably wouldn't think she was telling the truth.
Plenty of people in power believed anyone younger than 75 was an infant. But I'm not living on borrowed time. Alphas didn't last long in their positions. While some could rule for centuries, the average length was closer to a decade. Maybe a little less. And those were people with much more experience than Luke. He shrugged it off. I'm not going to be overthrown just yet. Something glinted in his hand, and suddenly Mel's scry stone was dangling from its chain. It's a pretty bauble. My pretty bauble. She didn't try to snatch it out of his hand. He would be too fast. I see you've come to your senses and have chosen to surrender it to me. Your cooperation is appreciated. He threw his head back and laughed. The sound filled the room and wrapped around Mel. Her heart jumped, just a little, but she ignored it. I think I would like you if you didn't keep stealing from me. The exhaustion had drained from his face, and he now looked almost like the young man he must have been once upon a time. She wondered what he would look like when he was really happy, not just caught off guard. If you're not giving me my necklace back, then what's the deal? He didn't need to know how important it was to her. She wasn't going to drive up the price. He slipped the necklace back into his pocket. Help me fix Cassie. She'd known it would come to that. From the moment he'd entered her room, there was no other outcome, and part of her was relieved. She had no reason to help Cassie out of the goodness of her heart, or out of the terror of what a hex could do. Still, she pretended to think about it. She let herself settle into the role of femme fatale, and swayed her hips as she walked across the room, clearing the distance between them. She got up close to Luke, laying a hand on his chest. Your sister's life is only worth a silly necklace? She asked. Luke's face was inches from her, his lips dangerously close, and he was just as focused on his goal as she was. Mel needed him distracted. So she kissed him. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but if her goal was distraction, she missed her target. Luke wasn't a man to just let himself be kissed, not when she wasn't playing like she was a peppy little co-ed anymore. He took control, devouring her. He pulled her close, almost crushing her, and kissed her with the intensity of a man who hadn't had a woman in centuries. No, he kissed her like he knew her, and like he hadn't been able to kiss her in centuries. It rocked Mel to her core, and she couldn't help but respond. Seduced by his passion, his desperation, she met his fervor with her own, swiping her tongue against his, feeling the heat coil through her. There was almost nothing she could think about except feeling him for just a little longer, just a little more. And then his hand closed around her wrist, crushingly hard. He pulled back and both of them panted. Normally I'd be happy to let a beautiful woman put her hands in my pants, but I can't help but think you have ulterior motives. Mel let her head fall against his chest and she smiled. You can't fault a girl for trying. He let go of her wrist and she stepped back. Mel expected anger, or at least exasperation. What she saw stunned her, caught her off guard. She saw hunger, but with a blink it was gone. Luke flexed his hand and grinned. Be careful. You might become predictable. We wouldn't want that. For some reason, she was glad he hadn't let her lift the stone. How messed up was that? But if she couldn't get her stone through conventional methods, she'd have to do something a bit unorthodox. She'd work for it. What are your terms? She saw his shoulders relax. He must have been on pins and needles all night. I need your expertise. I've got the car downstairs and we'll go back to Eagle Creek. You will be my guest, and free to go with your payment once Cassie is better. Mel knew that he thought those terms were fair. It must have been nice to be an alpha. She held up a hand and ticked off her points. 1. I will go to Eagle Creek under my own power, tomorrow. 2. I will bring with me a team who will also require guest status and safe passage out of town. And 3. The last point was both the most painful and most important. 3. I will receive my payment and not be punished or imprisoned if Cassie cannot be cured. I will be your consultant. I will try to the best of my ability to help you, but I offer no guarantee. This isn't some easy theft. Witchcraft is dangerous and tricky. I want you in town tonight. Mel put her hands on her hips. I'll be there tomorrow. Luke pointed towards the door, gesturing toward the parking lot. Did you think I came alone? You can come with me freely,
or you can come with me under duress. I don't care which way it is.
Mel had to keep an even tone. Luke wasn't thinking clearly, and with his sister on the line, she couldn't expect him to. No one will believe me if I ask them to come when I'm already at your place. They'll think it's a trap. So I'll be there tomorrow, and you'll just have to trust me. He had no reason to. Mel knew that, but she wasn't going with him, not even to save an innocent life. Luke was the type of man to take every hint of surrender and expand until he took everything. As an alpha, he had to be able to do that, but Mel wasn't his subject. She wasn't anything to him, and he didn't get to walk all over her. And to her shock, the alpha nodded his head.
But if you're not there by noon, I'm dragging you back whether you like it or not.
He grabbed the cell phone that she'd thrown at him the night before out of his pocket and tossed it to her.
Thought you might need this.
Mel wanted to toss it back to him. There was no telling what tracking software he'd put on it, but she wasn't going to give him the heads up. Thanks. I'll see you tomorrow. Maya was waiting for Luke when he got back. She typed furiously on a tablet and tapped her foot. Without looking at him when he entered the war room, she said, "We've got a problem." Of course they did. If he were a superstitious man, he might think he was cursed.
What is it this time? And how's Cassie?
He hadn't even had time to check on his sister this morning. She'd still been asleep when he and two of his enforcers headed out to Denver to track down Mel. He'd left Antonio behind to track the thief by the GPS in her phone. Though Luke doubted anything would come of it, he needed to try. "Cassie's asleep," Maya said carefully. It caught Luke's attention.
That's nearly 16 hours. Did something happen?
The other crisis could wait if Cassie needed him. Maya held the tablet close while she spoke. She woke briefly and had an uncharacteristic outburst. I had to call in Dr. Murphy to sedate her. Dr. Murphy wasn't a shapeshifter, but he was the town's only physician, and the story went that 10 years before Luke came to town, a slew of shifter violence had made it impossible to shield the good doctor from the fact that something unnatural was happening. He'd been brought in on the secret of the shapeshifter clan and treated them when their wounds were too serious for even accelerated healing to fix.
When was that?
He kept his tone even. He trusted Maya. If she hadn't called him at the time, she had a good reason. He didn't fear leaving her in charge, but that didn't mean he wanted her making medical decisions for his sister. Maya could clearly sense his frustration. "About 3 hours ago, just after you went radio silent to deal with the thief, the doctor said Cassie will probably sleep for a few hours, so she'll be up soon."
And the other emergency?
There was nothing he could do for Cassie while she slept that he hadn't already done. Peklo is getting restless. James Peklo was the least of Luke's worries, and he would have told the man to go to hell if it wouldn't have doomed the pack to war.
Restless how?
Peklo led the legion of vampires that Luke had put off meeting when Cassie disappeared. No group liked to be ignored, though, and rumor had it that Peklo was not a patient man when forced to wait, threatening to cancel the meet if he doesn't hear from you by the end of the day today. Despite the severity of the situation, Maya smiled, a wicked glint in her eye. I don't think he liked being put off by a woman.
Nothing would shock me about him.
Luke didn't want to deal with the vampire right now, but he couldn't avoid his responsibilities.
I'll call him tonight. He'll probably be happy if I just let him vent.
It occurred to him that Peklo might have had something to do with Cassie's disappearance, but if the vampiric leader was as smart as rumor suggested, he would never have been so obvious. And the guest they'd captured when Mel escaped claimed the man had nothing to do with him. That seemed to satisfy Maya. And how did it go with the thief? Luke wanted to give her an award for keeping the distaste out of her words. She had been absolutely opposed to his idea, and then she'd been offended when he didn't let her convince him that he was wrong. Luke remembered that kiss. Of all the things that happened, it should have been the least important, but it made him think of impossible things, like hope, the future, something outside of the life he now lived.
She'll be trouble, but just the kind we need.
After finishing with Maya, Luke went straight to Cassie. She wasn't awake, so he used the time to give Peklo a call. The vampire leader didn't answer. Luke left a message and considered his duty done. His hand was on the doorknob before he had second thoughts. Sitting next to Cassie for the rest of the day wouldn't make her any better. He tried to find anything to do, but his thoughts kept ricocheting between his sister, his thief, and the damned hope that everything would turn out all right. An hour later, he heard the screams. He ran, knocking aside one of his packmates and barreling through the door.
Cassie lay on the bed, the sheets wrapped around her knees and ankles, almost forming a knot. She let out a banshee shriek, her body arching off the bed before falling back down. She cried and cried. Luke got close. He wasn't afraid for himself, but he didn't want to hurt her. He looked behind to see the gathered crowd in the door and hallway. He met Mick's eyes.
Get Murphy now!
The boy took off running without further prompting. Cassie breathed in and out quickly, panting on the edge of hyperventilating. Luke smoothed back her hair. She was covered in sweat and her shirt stuck to her body. He needed to get her changed into something else. It couldn't be healthy to be stuck in damp clothes. Her eyes snapped open and for a second they were completely black. But she blinked again and they reverted to their normal brown. Luke hoped it had been a trick of the light. Her pupils expanded larger than normal. Help was coming. Tomorrow. Cassie sucked in a breath.
It hurts, she moaned, trying to keep it out.
Luke had to lean close to hear, her words slurred and quiet.
What are you trying to keep out?
He asked. She opened her mouth, but shuddered again before she could say anything. Luke didn't try to make her talk. It would only hurt her more. He should have forced his thief to come back with him.
Chapter 5. Mel knew to avoid the demon horse statue at Denver International Airport. As far as she knew, it wasn't actually a demon, and she didn't think it was cursed. But plenty of lore surrounded it, and she was already in enough trouble. She met Krista in the arrivals terminal. The witch's flight from Washington, D.C. had arrived, and the petite woman was already waiting for Mel. Krista was power and pain in concentrated form. She stood barely over 5 feet tall, and her spiked hair gave her another inch. If not for the perpetually confrontational look on her face, she might have seemed sweet, and Mel knew the woman would punch her if she ever called her a pixie out loud. Krista wore skinny jeans and an oversized t-shirt. She had a backpack slung over her shoulder and could have easily been one of the college students traveling over the autumn holidays. Not even the silver protection charm she wore on a necklace that dipped to her mid-chest suggested that she was merely an adept witch. They took a seat on one of the benches outside baggage claim, and Krista put up a soundboard. Usually when someone asks for 5 minutes, they don't make you fly halfway across the country to use them. And Mel was glad that she'd come. She knew that Krista didn't have to, that the bond between them was battered on the edge of being completely torn up. But twice now she'd come when Mel called, and that meant something. You know as well as I do that there are ears everywhere. You're lucky I wasn't busy, was all she said. Now, why aren't you tied up in some lion's basement having your entrails slowly pulled out? You're too close to his territory for them not to know you're here.
And you still came?
Mel smiled. She couldn't help it. Wouldn't be my first time pulling your ass out of the fire. Now talk. Your time is almost up. Mel pulled out the printout she'd made of the picture from her phone. She'd dumped the phone in a mall outside of the city after popping out the battery and SIM card. So far, the tale that Luke had put on her hadn't been able to catch up. This is a hex, right? She'd spoken with certainty to the Alpha, but a witch would always have more magical knowledge. Krista held the printout close to her face. The quality wasn't great. Mel had used the Hotel Business Center, and their printer had been purchased shortly after the printing press went out of style. But it should have been good enough to give Krista an idea. After a few minutes of studying the design on Cassie's back, Krista looked up, her face pale. This was on someone? That is some person's back? She sounded horrified. And that scared Mel. Krista didn't freak easily, and her skill with magic was some of the best for her age. An 18-year-old girl. I've been hired to find out how it happened and fix her. Krista raised an eyebrow. She knew all of Mel's tricks. Hired by who? There was no use hiding it. Luke Torres. The victim is his sister Cassie. It happened sometime after she was kidnapped and before she was returned safely yesterday night. Mel watched Krista carefully while she spoke. From the slight fist she made, Mel knew that Krista would have punched her in the shoulder, hard, if it weren't for the audience. I happened to be in the area to see the markings. Luke and another one of his packmates thought they were just bruises. I snapped a picture and they could see the hex after that. Krista took a deep breath and held up a hand to stop Mel from speaking further. You went back to his property?
And you want me to do a job with you when you're clearly suicidal? She spoke the last bit in a harsh whisper. I went back to get my scry stone, Mel explained. I had no way of knowing that there would be a hexed teenager on the premises. She watched Krista in silence. The witch didn't respond, but Mel could see the entire conversation happening behind her eyes. It was one of the benefits of knowing someone for more than 20 years. What's my guarantee that he doesn't throw me in a dungeon or whatever the second we step into his territory? Mel had to stop herself from smiling. Krista was in. I've negotiated safe passage as part of the deal. Krista stood up. Then we're wasting daylight. The drive to Eagle Creek passed smoothly and quietly. Each time Mel tried to start up conversation, Krista would change the radio station or turn up the volume. Except for one request to stop to use the bathroom, Krista kept her silence. Maya met the two women and led them inside. Who's your friend? She asked Mel. I'm a consultant. My name is Krista. You don't need to know anything else. Krista smiled sweetly, and Mel decided to say nothing. Actually, I need a lot more. Krista Anders, right? Witch, 31, daughter of Tina Anders, and suspected thief. Maya ticked off the facts with a sense of glee. If you knew, why did you ask? Krista crossed her arms. I'm here to do the job. This is my home. I don't allow strangers. A man cleared his throat. Mel smelled Luke and had to bite her lip to keep from grinning. What a strange reaction. What wasn't strange was the languid desire that flowed through her. She was getting used to that.
Actually, it's my home. Let them in, Maya.
Maya took a look at her alpha and stepped aside. Luke led them up 2 flights of stairs and down a hallway. Mel recognized it. They were right next to his quarters. Is Cassie all right? She asked. Luke stiffened.
I wish you had come yesterday.
Luke led Mel and her friend into Cassie's room. He thought the small woman was a witch. Who else would Mel call for help with a hex? And he couldn't be certain, but it was a close enough thing. The woman had helped Mel rob him, and she had probably given his thief the teleportation charm that let Mel escape him when he chased her, and he had let them both into his house. If that made him foolish, so be it. He'd play the fool 100 times to save Cassie. Neither woman reacted when he opened the door, at least, not in the extreme. He thought he saw Mel's mouth pull tight to one corner, but he blinked and it was gone. There would be no hysterics from these two. They were consummate professionals, even if his only exposure to them involved being their victim. That meant they were good.
We had to cuff her early this morning.
Luke hadn't asked where Maya got the fuzzy pink handcuffs, or why she had a pair of fuzzy handcuffs modified to restrain a shapeshifter. A shapeshifter could have broken out of them with little trouble, but an 18-year-old human didn't have the strength, and with her hands wrenched above her head, she didn't have the leverage either. Sweat plastered Cassie's blonde hair to her face, and her eyes seemed to burn with an almost red inner light. Though she was bound to the bed, she couldn't stop moving. Right then she was almost calm, only squirming a little and not trying to break the hold of the cuffs. Even with the padding, her wrists were bruised. She babbled a little when they came in, but the words made no sense. Just random Spanish and English that formed no coherent thought. Luke looked at Mel and saw sympathy in her green eyes. That was something.
She stopped talking, saying anything that made sense a few hours ago.
Krista took no time in assessing his sister. She crossed the room while Mel stood back with him. Krista looked over her shoulder. I'll need to touch her to determine the nature of the hex. Luke nodded. She may scream. This will probably hurt. She didn't wait for a second round of approval. Krista grabbed a small wooden chair and sat next to the bed. The hair on Luke's arm stood on edge as something decidedly not normal entered the room. Cassie! The power faded, and Krista looked at Luke once more. I need her full name. He was surprised she didn't know it already.
Cassandra Torres Jameson.
Krista nodded and turned back to the bed. Power swept through the room once more. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mel fold one arm across the front of her body and grip her elbow, balling her other hand in a fist. Luke didn't know what made him do it, but he stepped just a little closer to her and brushed the back of his hand against her fist. Her hand loosened, and he almost saw some of the tension ease out of her.
Cassandra Torres Jameson,
said Krista, her voice echoing even in the small room. Hear me.
Luke looked down when Mel grabbed his hand. She didn't. He decided not to make a big deal about it, instead turning his attention back to the witch. Krista spoke in a deep voice, but he couldn't understand what she said. At first he was convinced it was English, but after focusing for a moment it seemed to morph into Spanish, and then into something else entirely. But it was all gibberish. He couldn't tell what she was doing or saying to his sister. "Try not to focus on the words," Mel whispered. "If you can't do magic, you can't understand it." That wasn't the answer Luke wanted, but he wasn't an expert on spellcraft.
"How do you know so much about magic?"
He didn't have a right to ask. He didn't have any rights when it came to Mel, but it wasn't going to stop him from asking. Mel pulled her hand from his and laced her two hands together in front of her. "Cost of doing business," she said by way of explanation. Clearly that was a lie, but asking now would get Luke nothing, and part of him thought that when it came to this thief, he would want it all. Crazy thought, but it was there anyway. The power drained from the room once more, and Krista stood, turning away from Cassie and facing Luke and Mel. Her face bore a grim expression, her eyes tired. "I can soothe Cassie's pain," she said, "and I can counteract some of the more obvious manifestations of the hex, but I will need time to put together everything to completely rid her of it." For once, Luke let himself hope. Her words belied her expression.
"So you can make her better?"
he asked. Krista hesitated, and Luke gritted his teeth before she answered. "I can remove the hex, but I don't know if she'll survive. Cassie has given me her consent to try." Luke took a step toward her, but the petite witch held her ground.
"If you kill my sister, you will be a marked woman."
Mel placed a hand on his arm, and he whirled around to face her.
"What?"
"Krista won't kill Cassie. The hex will. If anything happens to Cassie, it won't be because we didn't try. So calm the fuck down right now." She looked him in the eye while she gave the command, her green eyes lit with an inner fire. If anyone had been in the room with them, Luke would have needed to reprimand her. No one gave the Alpha an order in his own territory, especially not an outsider who'd already stolen from him. But the strangest thing happened. Instead of anger, Luke smiled. It wasn't completely happy, but that was in the mishmash of emotions whirling around his head. A part of him liked that Mel was strong enough to boss him around. And if she and her witch saved his sister, he'd be in her debt forever. "We'll need Marco's powder." Krista addressed this to Mel, ignoring the temperamental lion between them. Mel shrugged with a grin. "Not too hard to steal." That shook Luke out of whatever he was feeling, at least for the moment.
"Is theft your first instinct for everything? Do you knock over a gas station when you need a gallon of milk?"
It came out as criticism, but he truly wanted to know. The only time he'd ever stolen something was when he was 9 years old and at the supermarket. His mother couldn't afford the piece of candy he wanted, so he'd taken one for himself. When she found it, she'd made him write a note of apology and told him that she'd send it back to the store. He was grounded for 3 weeks and forced to do extra English lessons for a month. Casually speaking about stealing anything just sat wrong with him. "Why would I steal milk?" asked Mel, her tone confused. "I don't steal from humans," she said. "Well, not usually."
"What's Marco's powder?"
he asked. They didn't have time to examine Mel's limited morality. Krista explained. "A witch named Marco Aguilar developed this powder which can counteract hexes about 100 years ago. It's the only thing that works if you can't get the original witch to undo the hex. And he guards it like a fucking dragon. He'll sell it to some people, but he hates other witches. And he won't sell to strangers. The good thing," said Mel, "is that it's so magically volatile that it can't be protected by any magic." Krista was on a team that stole it before. Mel and Krista shared a look that Luke couldn't decipher. He wondered what the history was between them. He turned to Krista.
"So you could take it again?"
The witch shook her head and shot a quick glance back at his sister. "I need to stay with Cassie. Mel can head it up. Who do you think we bring in?" she asked. "There are a few people we can trust. Joe hates Marco enough to do it." They wanted to bring in more members of their thieves' guild into his territory. That wasn't happening.
"I'll go with you."
Mel laughed. "You just balked at stealing milk." Luke let steel into his voice.
"She's my sister. I'll go."
Behind them, Cassie screamed. Luke lunged for the bed, shoving aside Krista in his race to do so. For the first time in hours, her words made sense, but it wasn't her voice that emerged from her mouth.
Meet at the clearing where you found the girl. Friday, midnight.
The voice was masculine, deep, not anything that Cassie could imitate, but she repeated the words twice before slumping down into unconsciousness.
Chapter 6. Mel shouldn't have laughed at the Alpha, and she knew she shouldn't have challenged him in his own home. But with Cassie's pronouncement, he seemed to forget it all. After Krista put a small sleeping spell on the girl, Mel, Krista, Luke, and Maya all met in his crowded little office to discuss the game plan.
First, you tell me what the hell that was in there,
Luke demanded.
Mel didn't like his tone. She wasn't accustomed to working so closely with her clients. Orders were for other people. But Krista could hold her own against the Alpha. It's a bridge created by the Hex. Temporary and more or less one way. We could hear him, but he couldn't hear or see us. He probably sent the message knowing that the girl would be guarded at all times and that someone would hear it. Mel hopped in before Luke could ask any more questions. Whatever they want, they're going to offer it in exchange for fixing Cassie. And judging by the effects of the Hex, they want something big. It's your choice what we do next. Luke didn't pause to think it through.
We're getting that damn powder, fixing my sister, and then I am going to obliterate whoever thought they were allowed to hurt her in the first place.
They spoke through the logistics, but had to break up for Mel to get the proper gear to pull off the heist. For that, she needed to go back to Denver, leaving Krista alone in the lion's den. But Krista insisted that she would be all right alone. Mel was shocked when Luke let her leave without an escort, and less shocked when she made her tail after driving out of town. It was difficult to tail a car down nearly deserted roads. She lost him about an hour before she entered the city. It took a few hours and several stacks of money to get the documentation and supplies, but she was back on the road to Eagle Creek before her tail found her again. Luke was ready to leave the moment she got back, and supremely displeased when she insisted that they delay until the morning. It's nearly 11, she said. I've been running around all day. She shoved a small manila envelope in his hands. Our flight leaves at noon tomorrow, direct to Mexico City. Memorize the details of your passport. She brushed past him. He covered the ground between them in 2 steps and was in front of her before she reached the stairs.
I didn't give you leave to wander my house freely.
Mel disdainfully looked him up and down. I'm going to see Krista. We have some final planning to do.
I'll escort you,
he said. She huffed but replied, Fine, and let him lead the way.
There's a room right down the hall that's set up for you and Krista. I had her move your stuff into it while you were gone.
He pointed to the door as they passed. Thank you. She'd been planning to stay at the motel in the town, but his house would be even better. And since she didn't need to hide anything from him, she didn't see a reason to refuse the invitation. Shouldn't this place be crawling with vampires? Luke looked over, his expression puzzled.
How exactly do you know what's supposed to be going on in my territory?
Mel shrugged and said nothing. She didn't think he would answer her initial question, but he surprised her. He'd been doing that a lot. She should have never guessed that he'd volunteer to steal with her. She was more excited at the prospect than she would even admit.
When Cassie was kidnapped, we delayed our plans. For now.
What's the meet about, anyway? Luke's territory was remote enough that he didn't need to worry about playing games if he didn't want to. He could pretend that vampires and witches didn't exist, and most of the time it would have no effect on his world.
Business. The clan I was meeting with has a proposal for a transportation company, and they want my assurance of safe passage for their trucks down the interstate.
He didn't try to make it sound intriguing. Mel laughed. That seems like something you could handle by email. Luke returned her smile.
You know the old ones. If it's not inscribed in Latin by monks, it's not real communication.
He opened the door to Cassie's room where Krista sat holding the girl's hand. He looked at his sister and spoke to Mel.
I wish they had done this to me.
It hurt to hear him say that, but not in the way that Mel was used to. She didn't know anyone who would throw themselves in front of a hex for her. She didn't want someone to do that. But for a second, the thought of that level of care appealed. She pushed it aside. Cassie will be okay. She tried to comfort him, but his expression had closed off. Krista is an amazing witch. She'll get it done. He left without saying goodbye, merely nodding and closing the door behind him. Krista looked up from her patient. Is that going to be an issue? She asked.
Mel raised an eyebrow and looked quickly over her shoulder at the closed door and back again. Is what going to be an issue? You're making kissy faces with the alpha. I want to know if I'm going to get screwed over when he decides he doesn't like me. Steel hardened her tone, and she offered no quarter. Mel wanted to turn back around and go to her room. She didn't have time to deal with Krista's distrust, but she hadn't earned the luxury of asking her to stuff it. She kept her voice low to avoid being overheard. I was wrong about Chance. I let myself get manipulated by him. I'm not going to do that shit again. Even saying his name hurt. 2 years ago, Chance had been a kindred soul on a heist in Cincinnati. But it turned out that Mel had been the only one to feel that way. Krista threw her hands up. I don't give a shit about Chance. She fussed with Cassie's blanket while she continued. You made a stupid mistake there, so what? But if I can't trust you to have my back when other people are involved, then I can't trust you at all. Mel crossed the room and stopped herself a moment before she would have put a hand on Krista's shoulder. I have your back. That was one time in 20 years, and I couldn't be sorrier than I am now. But you're my best friend, Chris. I count on you. Krista didn't turn around, and she spoke so quietly that even with Mel's excellent hearing, she almost couldn't make out what the witch said. You're not sorry. You just want everything to go back to how it was. Newsflash, Mel, we're not friends. And I can't count on you. Once this job is done, just leave me alone. An argument bubbled up in Mel's throat, a plea for absolution. But it would get them nowhere and only breed resentment. Mel left the room with no idea how to make things right. Luke was ready at the crack of dawn, with only a backpack containing 2 changes of clothes and a small toiletry kit. Mel instructed him to pack light. Vince, who was still on probation for a stunt involving a snowmobile, had been assigned to take him and Mel to a private airport an hour away from his territory. He hadn't even known the airport existed, and was beginning to think that a lot more shady dealings were going on around him than he had ever been aware of. When she came down the stairs, it was evident that Mel was not a morning person. Luke wasn't either, but he tried to hide it. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore no makeup. The clothing she'd chosen looked more comfortable than fashionable, but he thought she wore the hell out of it. Given that her job more or less required a nocturnal routine, Luke had assumed she wouldn't be awake come morning. He held up a thermos and handed it over when she reached the bottom of the stairs.
Fresh, black,
he said.
I don't know how you take it, but we've got time if you need to hit up the kitchen.
Mel flipped back the lid on top and took a long drink, wincing as the liquid burned her mouth. She gave it a second and smiled at him. Black's fine, thank you. Vince carried both of their bags out to the car and they followed behind. They settled into the back of a discreet black SUV, and Luke pulled the passport that Mel had given him out of his pocket. He flipped through the pages of the document. It drew her eyes downward. Once he had her attention, he asked,
You know I speak Spanish, right?
Yeah? The vehicle pulled out, and they were off while he watched Mel try to figure out where he was going with his questions.
And that I'm Mexican?
He smiled as he continued. Mel just nodded, clearly carefully storing up her quota of words she'd speak in the morning.
So why is my passport Canadian?
He flashed the front page at her where Canada was written clear as day. It was Canada or Greece, Mel replied. Do you speak Greek? She leaned her head all the way back against the seat, exposing the line of her throat and yawning wide. Luke watched her as she tried to get comfortable, squirming sideways, rearranging her legs, and finally landing half on her side, resting her head on her shoulder and looking in his direction. She looked at him for a long moment before he remembered that she'd asked a question.
No, unless you count the alphabet.
She nodded, but he wanted to keep her attention.
I thought about rushing in my freshman year, but some other stuff came up.
Mel laughed. You don't seem like the frat boy type. Luke angled his body closer, leaning in so that his head half covered the small seat between them. The world rolling by outside didn't exist as far as he was concerned. All he could see was his thief and her big green eyes.
You're not using your imagination,
he said. A strand of her hair had fallen out of her ponytail. He reached up and tucked it behind her ear.
I was 18 years old, a continent away from home, and ready for shenanigans.
Her eyes sparkled, and she bit her bottom lip. I didn't know alphas were allowed to engage in shenanigans.
I wasn't an alpha then, just a dumb kid.
He didn't have any malice towards his younger self, no matter how stupid he'd been as a teenager.
And California was a bit different than Connecticut.
She laughed again, the burst of sound engulfing him and loud enough to cause Vince to spare a glance back at them. But the boy quickly averted his gaze.
First it's frat boy, then Yale? How did you end up banished to the hinterlands of Colorado?
While the mirth roiled through her, she leaned closer and her hand brushed against his arm. He thought it was unintentional, but she didn't move it back.
I went to Stanford, thank you.
But he wouldn't point out that he'd gotten into both schools. There was no need to brag, at least not about that. But answering her question was complicated.
When I was a kid, we had a huge territory. Miles and miles and miles. My dad was the alpha of a small pack, and my mom ruled at his side. I don't remember a lot, but I remember the forest.
But he didn't want to go into all of that. He liked Mel against his better judgment, but he didn't need to tell her everything.
And when we came to America, we had this shoebox of an apartment. Scott is great, but he lived in the city. I guess I became a city cat. But then when we came out here...
He looked over her shoulder and smiled at the mountains in the distance.
I knew I had to make it mine.
He reached for her hand and entwined his fingers with hers. It felt so right to touch her that he couldn't resist.
What about you? Shock me with stories of honor roll.
Mel shook her head, smiling all the while. No, I was never in school long enough to make honor roll. She thought for a moment, her eyes rolling up before settling back to normal. Though I think I have a trophy that one high school gave out to all the honor students.
You stole an honor student trophy?
Hardly the worst thing I've taken. Pride laced her tone. It broke the spell. Luke pulled back and sat facing forward in his own chair. The only reason Luke was with her now, the only reason he was in this mess, was because she'd broken into his house and taken something that belonged to him. His sister wouldn't be in danger if it weren't for Mel, and he was about to commit several crimes just to undo the damage. Why the hell couldn't he remember that when he was around her? Chapter 7. Mel napped for most of the trip to Mexico City after the Alpha turned cold. She should have expected his reaction, though she couldn't figure out why it stung so much. She'd done her job, and she didn't feel bad about that. If only Cassie hadn't been hurt. No kid deserved to be dragged into shit like this. They landed at a small private airstrip outside of the city. Money greased the correct palms on both sides of the border, and they were on the road within 15 minutes of stepping out of the plane and into the hot Mexican sun. The drive wasn't far, though as they got close to the city, it became beyond clogged. She pulled off the highway after an hour of driving and into a nice residential neighborhood.
Do we have a plan?
Luke asked, breaking his hours-long silence.
Or are you going to just knock on this Marco guy's front door?
Mel should have fought when he decided to tag along. Bob had to be available somewhere, and he could work with her much better than an angry lion who had retired from a life of theft before he hit puberty. Yes, I have a plan. I'm not exactly new at this. She pulled into the driveway of a small yellow cottage. It would have looked at home on a postcard with 2 children playing in the small front yard with a dog frolicking beside them. Instead, everything looked perfectly put together, only one step away from sterile.
Where are we?
Asked Luke. Mel turned and smiled. My house. She turned off the car and opened her door. Come on, we need to get ready to go.
You have a house in Mexico City? You have a house at all?
He seemed to be having trouble with the concept as he grabbed his bag and met her on the way to the front door. Mel unlocked it and revealed the orange-painted walls and old furniture that made up the living room. Luke stepped inside and took a look around.
It doesn't exactly scream thieves' den.
Mel set her bag down on the couch and flipped on the lights. Well, I keep the Picassos in the basement. You don't just leave those out for anyone to see. When he didn't laugh, she glanced over her shoulder to see his brows drawn down as he scrutinized her words. Really? She asked. You seriously think I have a stash of stolen art here? It's a safe house, you know? Meant to be safe? She gestured down the hallway off the living room. There's a bathroom down there. I keep the utilities on all the time, so it should be good. Just take a shower and we'll talk once you're clean. Luke left without another word, walking slowly, studying every inch of her house. After a few minutes, she heard the bathroom door close and the water start up. Almost immediately, she realized the error of her ways. Luke was getting naked, in the shower, in her house. If she had X-ray vision, she could see him right now. He was that close. Probably a good thing she didn't. Her resolve only went so far. She tried to focus, to set things up so that she could give Luke something to study while she cleaned herself up.
but the drip of the water against the tile kept distracting her, and she could almost picture the water sliding down his tight abs. She'd never seen them, but she'd felt them through his clothes. Very tight. Her hands balled into fists. 1 minute of fantasy wouldn't hurt anyone, but only 1 minute. Then she had to work. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. His hair would be plastered to his forehead and slicked back against his scalp, and his golden brown skin would be hot under the steaming water. Mel imagined running her fingers over his muscles, tracing shapes in the water and feeling him shiver under her touch. But her hands wouldn't be satisfied to play against his arms for long. In her mind, she reached down, gliding over the sharp contours of his muscles, until her hand hovered right over his naked cock. If she couldn't have him in real life, she'd settle for a feel in her daydream. A commotion rose as Luke must have knocked over a bottle on the ledge of the shower. Mel opened her eyes. That was not part of the fantasy, but the thought of a clumsy alpha made her smile, and then immediately frown. She needed to think over her plan one more time to ensure he wouldn't be near anything breakable that could give their plans away. She was able to keep her attention focused after her small fantasy, and by the time Luke came out of the bathroom toweling off his damp hair, Mel could safely ignore him. Really, the thought of what he would look like naked wasn't even a consideration. It was a good thing that being a good liar was a necessity in her job. She could almost believe it when she tried to pull one over on herself. No matter what she was feeling, she wouldn't show it. Read up on Marco while I clean up. We roll out at 7. Luke sat down on the threadbare couch and picked up a folder containing all the pertinent details on Marco's compound and the security around the powder. He glanced through the first page and looked up.
We can seriously get in there?
He didn't flash her the picture of Marco's property. He didn't need to. Marco lived in a fortress even more guarded than Luke's. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and with a press of a button, the entire place could go on lockdown, all windows closed by steel shutters and the doors blocked by concrete. It would be nearly impossible to break in. Luckily, Mel didn't need to. He holds a monthly gathering to which I happen to have a standing invitation. She sat down. It was better to explain this now before Luke read through the material and got spooked. You'll go in as my +1. Marco will think you're either sleeping with me or that you're my muscle. Or both. Luke's nostrils flared, but Mel had to ignore it. That meant nothing. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had such trouble focusing on a job. The thought was a bucket of ice on her train of lust. While it was unpleasant to think about, it did bring her back in line. Anyway, she continued when she realized she'd paused for too long, he keeps his backup supply in his office. We'll need to switch it out with something of equal weight, but the lift itself shouldn't be too hard.
Do you get chased by a giant stone ball if the measurement is off?
He asked. Mel smiled. Not quite, and I don't carry a whip with me. She shrugged. Not usually, anyway. There's a 3-second delay on the weight sensor. Or there was a year ago. We're going to have to hope he hasn't changed that, or we're boned.
Won't this Marco guy have his shit on lockdown if he knows he's going to have guests?
Luke tossed one paper on the table and picked up another. He didn't look at Mel while he spoke.
And if you're friendly enough to have a standing invitation to his Mexican palace, why can't you just buy this powder from him?
Mel had to be careful with her response. Men like Luke didn't like to find out the gritty details that women like her needed to know, and she wasn't interested in a moral debate. Stealing is easier than what he'll ask me to pay. And if I give him what he wants this time, my relationship with the man will be ruined. I'll be a client, not a colleague.
I won't ask you to prostitute yourself for my sister.
The matter-of-fact tone, his lack of judgment, lifted a weight from Mel's chest that she hadn't realized she'd felt. He offered no censure, and didn't call her character into question. How refreshing. But there was more for him to read than she had time to explain, so she stood up from the sofa. We'll go over the rest once I'm cleaned up. Your clothes are in the garment bag. Mel took her time in the shower, and even more time afterward preparing her hair and makeup. For a simple dinner party, it would have been all right for her to let her hair hang around her shoulders. But since she knew she'd muss it up in the middle of the heist, she needed to spend more time twisting it every which way and pulling it up. The makeup was simple. A smudge of color around her eyes, a lipstick that claimed it wouldn't smudge for hours, and a bit of blush. All part of her uniform. She pulled on a pair of tight-fitting black pants and a dark top. The second Marco saw her outfit, he'd be on high alert. Luckily for her, he had no reason to think that she'd steal his powder. And with Luke with her, he'd expect it even less. 2 shapeshifters couldn't do magic, and had no need for magic potions. She walked out of the bathroom after nearly an hour and froze in her tracks when she saw Luke. He wore the hell out of his suit. She'd asked Maya to put Luke's nicest suit in the SUV before they left, and the quality was stunning. It had to be worth at least $3,000. Perfectly tailored, and fit him like a glove. Mel didn't lick her lips, but she wanted to. And if the job wasn't on the line, she would have done more than ruffle his hair and wrinkle the clothes. As it was, she could do neither. Once her thoughts were under control, she asked, Armani? Luke looked down and straightened one of the sleeves.
Gucci, actually.
He offered no more explanation for why he had such an expensive suit. But Mel had already filed away several details of Luke's life. The guy came from money. Maybe he hadn't been born to it, but his stepdad wasn't suffering for cash. And by that token, neither was Luke, not for at least 20 years. She didn't hold it against him. In her line of work, she had only rarely been strapped for cash. But it was important to know a partner's background, his potential weaknesses, and his potential strengths. Think of this like a business dinner, she said. Marco invites anywhere between 12 and 20 people at least once a month. A few, like me, have standing invitations. We drop in when we're in town. The rest will be people who either want something from him or who he wants something from. Mel reached down and dug through her bag. She came out with a small black box. Luke took it when she offered and flipped open the lid.
I have my own cufflinks,
he said. Mel smiled. Not like these. She pulled out another box and flipped it open to reveal a matching ring. There was a diamond in the middle with a small ruby set along one edge and an emerald on the other. They're an enchanted set, she explained. Obviously, we'll need to split up at some point. We can use these if we get in deep shit. Luke examined the cufflinks.
Do I speak into them? His tone bordered between sarcastic and serious.
No. Mel slipped a ring on and flashed it to him. She twisted the stones towards the ruby. Luke jerked, tossing the cufflinks up before catching them again. The central diamond had turned a bright red.
It's hot, what the hell?
Mel chuckled. Red means, I'm in deep shit, come get me. She twisted toward the green, and he didn't jerk this time, but his hand did tighten around the cufflinks. Cold, right? Green is, I'm getting out, meet me at the rendezvous point. You just turn the stone either way. Shift back to center until the diamond is clear again to deactivate the charm. He studied the gems.
Clever. Do you have a definition of deep shit? Or may I trust my own judgment?
Mel bit her tongue to stop herself from saying anything that would compromise their teamwork. You're a big boy, she settled on. I'm sure you'll be fine. The drive to Marco's didn't take long, though Mel didn't go directly there. She had a few more things to set up before she was ready to put her plan in play. Luke went along, only asking questions every so often, and otherwise making no conversation. As the sun set, she pulled up in front of a palatial estate, Marco's home. A gold and white gate opened to let her drive down a long driveway which led to an enormous house. There were 6 arches made of yellow stucco and covered by a tiled roof. The double door to the main entrance was over 10 feet wide when both were open. The grounds were covered in a verdant grass and trees that took far more water than was natural to maintain in such a hot climate. The house screamed money, and Mel's hands itched to see what Marco had inside. But she had to behave. This trip had only one objective. There were already several cars parked on the driveway. Most, like her, drove dark SUVs, though there was also a Rolls-Royce and a Ferrari. Before they got out of the car, Mel put a hand on Luke's forearm. Remember, you're not Luke Torres in there. You don't speak Spanish, and you're trying to hide the fact that we're sleeping together. He sputtered.
What? I'm...
Your character, she reminded him. You're playing a role. And red is rescue me, green is get out. Don't be a hero. She gave his arm a squeeze. You can do this. They left the car and walked up the long driveway to the entrance of the house. With each step, Luke loosened up. She kept shooting glances to the side, amazed at the transformation. By the time she knocked on the door, he might as well have been a different man. He stood a step too close for casual comfort and let his hand fall by his side, brushing against her thigh for just a moment too long. Mel let herself smile. They were already being watched on the security camera. He was perfect. Marco's butler, a human man nearing 60, opened the door. His face hid any shock at seeing Mel, and he led them inside to join the fray.
Chapter 8. Luke wondered if Mel feared that he would wipe his mouth with the tablecloth or ask if they had a cement pond out back. Simply because he didn't live ostentatiously at home didn't mean he had no experience in the world of the rich and gaudy. He and Mel were the last to arrive, and judging by the reactions of everyone in the house, they hadn't been expected. He mentally matched names to the fact sheets that Mel had made him study before they left. There were only 3 people he didn't recognize, one of whom was a man with dark hair in the far corner of the room. He was the only person not at least half-angled towards the door. But the mark, he corrected himself, approached them. Marco Aguilar should have been taller, given the way both Mel and Krista said his name. In just a day, Luke had already built him up as some kind of legend in his imagination. But the man stood a little under 6 feet tall, stocky, and had a wicked scar that cut through half of his left cheek. Witches weren't the most hardy when it came to immortals, but that he'd survived the wound and not bothered to cover it up let Luke know that the man could take a beating. Mel offered no comment on where the scar had come from. Apparently it was not spoken of in polite company. His skin was a dark brown and his hair shiny and black. He wore it close to his head. Marco wore no jewelry, but his suit was of the highest quality, dark gray and nicely fitted. If the house hadn't made it obvious, the clothing did. The man bled money, and from the company gathered around the white marble room, he collected power as well. Marco approached Mel with both arms out and a huge smile on his face. He showed no surprise at the thief's presence, but from the way 2 security guards moved out of the corner of Luke's eye, Luke knew that the witch had notified his staff to be on high alert. Marco kissed both of Mel's cheeks and spoke. His accent was tinged with a hint of the Mediterranean, though Luke didn't know if it was African or European.
"My dearest cat," said Marco, "after all these years you finally show up, and on such short notice."
Mel let him keep hold of her hands while she spoke. Luke was surprised they spoke in English, though it might have been the most common language given the company.
"I was in the area," Mel explained, "and my companion here has begged to see what Mexico has to offer. I could think of no one better than you to stand as an example." While she spoke, she was Mel, but not the Mel that Luke had come to think of as the real one. There was a harshness to this version of her, like cut glass, that he hadn't seen when they were alone. Yes, she could be ruthless, but it was a ruthlessness honed by determination. Here she showed a hint of cruelty. Was this really her? He hoped for his own sake, for Cassie's sake, and for the sake of his pack that cruelty was an act, because he was trusting her with everything.
"Who is your companion?"
Marco inquired. He gave Luke a once-over and dismissed him. "A friend," was all Mel said. Her vagueness did not pique the witch's interest. Marco took Mel's arm and led her across the room. Luke followed a step behind, their silent shadow. He didn't try to look menacing. He'd learned long ago that it was far more effective to seem aloof, rather than intentionally dangerous. Marco displayed his power through the company gathered and the objects dotting the edge of the large room. Expensive jewelry and statues stood on marble pillars. None of it was protected by obvious security, so Luke assumed there were magical deterrents. Mel seemed to be able to sense magic. Luke didn't have that talent. He took stock of the company. Nicholas Souza, the jewel of the Mexican vampire scene for nearly a century, spoke to a man with dark skin in the corner of the room. Luke couldn't place the man, and his eyes kept slipping off of him before he could get a good look at his features. Juan and Guadalupe Mendoza were with a group of other shapeshifters. Even before reading their file, Luke had been aware of the couple. They'd made a name for themselves by carving out a chunk of territory in central Mexico and labeling it as a safe haven. No violence, no infighting. They ruled with iron claws and remained unchallenged after 50 years. Not everyone at the party was Mexican. There were several European guests and a few from Asia and Africa as well. And everyone was speaking English. Everyone except for the 3 men on the far side of the room. In Mexico, Spanish should not have seemed out of place, but in this room it was. Luke listened for a moment, and then the man with dark hair who he'd noted immediately when he entered spoke. Luke's blood turned to ice. This was Inicio Nunca, the man who'd murdered his father. It had been more than 25 years since he'd last seen him, and yet the man's face was as fresh in his mind as it had been when he was 6 years old. Like most adult shapeshifters, he hadn't aged a day past 40. His face only bore a few wrinkles, and his hair was as black as jet. He laughed at something one of his men said, throwing his head back and letting the sound echo through the room. He had already taken 2 steps toward him when he felt Mel's hand on his arm. She barely spoke above a whisper. "What's up, Torres?" His name jolted him enough to think about where he was. He almost kept quiet, a plan to ambush the man beginning to form in the back of his mind. But they were working together now. If he didn't tell Mel, she might abandon him here, might abandon Cassie.
That man in the corner.
He nodded in Nunca's direction.
He killed my father.
Mel didn't glance directly at them. Instead, she turned her head slowly, taking in the entire room. She didn't pause when her eyes lit on Nunca, and by the time she looked back at him, Luke didn't know if she knew which man he was talking about. Braids or Scar?
Scar.
Luke hadn't noticed the man with braided hair. His entire focus had been wrapped up in the murderous shapeshifter. Mel closed her eyes for 3 seconds and took a deep breath. Inicio Nunca controls the largest pack in Mexico. Not even the cartels fuck with him. She took another deep breath, and Luke wondered what was going through her head. Is he going to recognize you?
No, he hasn't seen me since I was 6.
He hadn't seen the fight that took his father from him. His mother had shoved him into the arms of one of the teenagers there that night and instructed them to run and hide until she came to find them.
And he might think I'm dead anyway.
26 years was a long time, and they lived in a dangerous world. The black man that Luke had noted earlier walked up to them. He addressed Mel.
It's so unexpected to see you here. And you've brought a guest?
The man looked Luke up and down. There was something familiar about him, but Luke couldn't latch onto it. It was almost like there was a disconnect between his eyes and his brain. "A colleague," said Mel. "Would you like an introduction?"
You've been standing in the center of the room more than 2 minutes. Marco will figure out you're up to something very soon.
The man turned to Luke and nodded.
I'm Bob, by the way.
It meant nothing to Luke, but the man clearly knew Mel and was perhaps her friend. With deliberate nonchalance, they made their way to the side of the room where they could speak. They hadn't escaped the prying eyes of the crowd, but they were no longer the center of attention. Mel continued their conversation as if they hadn't just added a 3rd member to their party. That, more than anything, let him know that Bob could be trusted, at least when it came to Mel's concerns. "Choose now. Do you want revenge or to help Cassie? We can't do both tonight." It burned him up to know that Nunca was in the same room as him. Luke had not hunted the man down before, but it seemed that fate had put the 2 of them together. But if the choice was between revenge for an old wound and acting to save his sister, it wasn't a choice at all.
I can always find him later.
Mel stared at him for a moment, their eyes locked. She quirked up an eyebrow. "Give me your word on that."
I've made my decision. It's not my fault if you don't trust it.
The gathering moved on around them, people mingling, admiring Marco's works.
Now, are we going to get to work, or are you going to spend the rest of the night worried about my focus?
Mel considered it a great sign of character that she didn't smack the alpha hard against the cheek. But with Bob standing right there and the rest of the room ready to latch onto anything interesting, she kept her impulses in check. Besides, the reaction wasn't entirely his fault. Things were going belly up if she didn't fix them quickly. What the hell was Bob doing here? She couldn't ask him in so many words. He clearly had a reason to be there, just as she did. She only hoped they weren't after the same goal.
I'm going to mingle,
Luke said, enacting phase 1 of their plan and leaving her alone to speak with Bob. Bob spoke before she even had a chance to turn and face him.
You're keeping interesting company, and clearly it's of your own free will.
2 could play at that game. I thought you hated fancy parties. Bob shrugged.
Marco's a friend.
And she wasn't. He'd made that abundantly clear when they worked together to steal the Scarlet Emerald.
Are you after what I think you're after?
He asked. Are you going to tell Marco? She replied. She hoped Bob still respected her enough to give her a warning, and hated herself for knowing she barely deserved one.
He knows what you are. I'd say that's warning enough.
Bob took a sip of champagne from the flute he held loosely.
I've got useful information if you tell me why you've chosen your particular partner.
He wouldn't lie. It wasn't that there was honor among thieves, but they had been partners many times before, and Bob wouldn't let idle curiosity ruin a business relationship, and she trusted his discretion. He's got my scry stone and some witches hurt Cassie. She couldn't say the actual word where Marco was sure to hear it, but Bob understood. His eyes widened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral.
So are you doing it for payment, then?
She didn't answer. Bob didn't press the issue. He offered his information, fulfilling their bargain.
The weight sensor is malfunctioning. He's spreading it around that he has no product available, but it's just a cover until he can fix his security.
I could kiss you right now. She tried to keep the excitement out of her voice and probably failed miserably.
I think your alpha would object.
He walked away before she could disagree or tell him that there wasn't anything going on between them. Luke wasn't her alpha, just as she wasn't his thief. They were business partners, and once Cassie was better, they would go their separate ways. For good. She grabbed her own wine and spoke with several of the attendees. Sitting sullenly in the corner would serve no purpose, and Marco would know it was out of character. Luke found her after a while, a smile on his face.
I've heard of the Mendozas, he said, but I never thought I would meet them.
Starstruck? She grinned at him, his excitement infectious.
You do realize that some people find me intimidating?
He asked, deceptively casual. Mel couldn't wait to be alone with him the next time he took that tone. But not just yet. They're all fools. You're a giant kitten.
Let's see if you feel that way when you see my claws, thief.
Menace didn't lace his words. It was seduction. If Mel was a different person, if they were in a different place, she'd act far differently than she needed to. But Lord knew she wanted to play with the alpha. Rundown? She asked, all business. Luke followed her lead, switching gears.
Rotation of 3 security guards. They pass by every 10 minutes. I couldn't get out of the immediate vicinity without arousing suspicion.
Mel nodded. Good, then we're still on.
Who's Bob?
He asked. Marco signaled them all to come to dinner, and they both went, sharing whispers all the way. An occasional colleague and former friend. He knows who you are and why we're here. He won't sell us out. Saying it out loud firmed her resolve. He's here for his own reasons, but he would have told me if they interfered with ours.
You trust him?
They entered Marco's dining room. The room wasn't exactly the correct term. He'd transformed the patio into a tropical paradise. A large table stood at the center, surrounded by palm trees and tropical flowers. Torches offered meager light. Even so late in the year, the weather was pleasant, with only the slightest chill in the air. Servers brought out the first course, a spoonful of cold soup and assorted vegetables that might have been a full appetizer at a finer restaurant. Marco called down from the head of the table.
Mel, tell us about your friend. I've always wanted to host someone of Lucio Torres's caliber. I understand he has his own roots in this fine country, and that we even have something like a family connection.
Mel didn't look over at Luke, and she hoped he didn't give himself away. At this point, she had to trust him to follow her lead. I knew you would appreciate him, she said. Though I apologize for the subterfuge, there are always layers of red tape when he travels without his entourage.
Once I heard about your event, I couldn't resist the invitation. I hope I'm not intruding.
Luke held up a glass.
To a fine host.
The rest of the guests followed suit. Lupe Mendoza was the first to speak. What family connection is there? She asked. Neither Luke nor Mel answered, so Marco took over for them.
Senor Nunca is now alpha over the land Mr. Torres's father once called his own. Why, that practically makes them brothers, I think.
For the first time, Nunca studied Luke.
Torres, you say?
He looked the other alpha up and down, taking his time. Luke didn't take his eyes off of him.
I seem to recall a different name all those years ago. And you were quite young. Rumor was that you didn't survive. I'm glad to know the rumor was false.
Mel wanted to reach over and grab Luke's hands, though she didn't know if she wanted to offer comfort or beg for restraint. But she couldn't let him look weak. Even though she had brought him here, this was his battle, and he'd promised not to take revenge. She would trust him. It was the only thing she could do.
I was tougher than I looked,
Luke said with utter calm.
and it was years ago.
The tension didn't disperse. It couldn't. But conversation turned away from a leadership challenge that took place decades ago to certain political matters in the region. Only then did Mel slowly move her hand under the table and give Luke's thigh the tiniest squeeze. He was doing well, and it was just about showtime. Dinner broke up and it was time to put their plan into action. Mel looked at her watch. At exactly 9:32 she would leave the room. They had 6 minutes, at which point she'd either have the powder or she wouldn't, and they'd have to figure out something else. Mel waited until the appointed time and ducked out of the room, trusting that Luke would do his part. She used the information that he'd given her about the guards to extrapolate their rotation, and didn't meet a single one on the way to Marco's office. The office was closed with a simple lock. Her lockpicks took care of it in an instant and she was inside. Under normal circumstances, she would have disabled the security cameras or tried to avoid them. But she hadn't had time. So she hoped she could work fast enough that she would be done by the time the guards came to stop her. The powder was stored in a fingerprint-coated safe behind Marco's desk in a locked cabinet. Mel assumed that, like most people, Marco didn't remember to wipe away his old fingerprint when he accessed the safe. She covered her finger in latex and pressed down on the finger scanner. The light turned green. Success. Inside the safe was a clay container with the anti-hex powder inside. Trusting Bob's assessment, Mel scooped out just a little bit of powder and put it into a plastic bag. She stuffed the bag into her bra and closed the safe and the cabinet. All in all, the theft had taken less than 3 minutes. She turned the stone on her ring to green and ran out of the house, continuing to avoid the guards. She got to the car first and drove away, not waiting for Luke to get to the car. He was expecting it. They couldn't risk getting locked on the property if Marco realized that she'd robbed him. Mel drove to the rendezvous point and waited. After 15 minutes, she had nearly given up hope. Either Luke had been captured, or he had abandoned her. Or worse. Her ring wasn't lit up, so he didn't want her help, and she had no other way of knowing if he needed it. Another 5 minutes passed before the passenger side door opened and he slid in the car. The Alpha panted, but he'd moved with such stealth that she hadn't heard him approach.
Did you get it?
He asked. Mel put the car in gear and took off. I did. Anyone following? He shook his head. When he moved to put on his seatbelt, he winced, sucking in a pained breath. But he fastened the belt as quickly as possible. Are you hurt? It came out more harshly than Mel intended.
I'm okay, just a bruised rib. Had a bit of an altercation back there.
Mel couldn't stop the car to see if his injuries were even worse than he said. She put her foot on the gas, accelerating so that she could speed all the way back to the safe house. Chapter 9. Luke might have underestimated the extent of the damage to his side, but Nunca's goons had fists like brick walls, and even avoiding most of the hits had left him aching. Shapeshifter healing was a boon, however, and by the time they were back to the safe house, he could move without wanting to wince with every step. Mel wasn't prepared to let him tend to his own wounds. She made him sit on one of her chairs and ordered him to remove his top if he didn't want her to cut it off. He thought she was serious and moved as quickly as he could, bearing himself from the waist up. She didn't bother with a first aid kit. Instead, after taking a minute to secure their bounty in a hidden safe, she knelt down in front of him and placed her hands on the purple bruises on his naked torso. Luke sucked in a breath, and not because it hurt. Well, it did hurt, but the feel of her delicate fingers on his exposed flesh was enough to turn his mind in another direction. He clenched his fist at his side and tried to think of anything else. Anything appropriate that wouldn't lead him down the road to another massive mistake. It's bruised now, she told him. She didn't poke hard enough to make it hurt any more. Should be completely healed by morning. We fly out at 10. She didn't remove her hand from his chest.
You sure you got enough of that powder?
He asked. Mel rolled her eyes and smiled. Not my first rodeo, Alpha. She tried to slide her hand away, but he covered her fingers with his own, clasping her to him. The smile slid off her face, replaced by something hotter. She licked her lips. It would be incredibly stupid to do anything with her. Whatever they'd done in the past was the past. But Luke was tired of being smart. He slid off the chair and to his knees in front of her. Only inches separated them,
and their hands were still locked together against his side. "This is probably a mistake," she tried to warn him, but her eyes were glued to his lips and lit with a desperate desire. Luke felt the same thing within himself. Something about Mel was so right that every moment apart from her felt like something hollow, like he was missing something integral that he hadn't known he needed to function. Ever since that first moment he saw her, it had been a constant ache inside of him.
"Some mistakes need to be made,"
he said, and this was a mistake he couldn't go another second without making. He closed the distance between them as she slid both of her arms around him, planting her fingers on his back. Their lips met. Luke hadn't kissed her in more than 2 days, and he never wanted to go so long between tasting her lips again. In this, she was his equal, neither dominating him nor letting him dominate. Fire roared inside him, hardening him, bringing him to life. If he thought that he'd been riding adrenaline earlier, it was nothing compared to this. They tumbled to the floor, Mel careful of his wounded ribs, but otherwise giving him no quarter. She lay on top of him, hands in his hair and lips mad against his own. Luke pulled her closer, his fingers digging into her sides. He needed the contact, needed to touch her. He found the hem of her shirt and let his fingers explore under, splaying across her naked skin. It was hot, silken. He was already hard, aching for her and only her. Since the moment he'd seen her, it had just been Mel. Whatever name she used, whatever disguise, he was hers in this madness. Her own hands quested, unbuttoning his shirt, spreading her hands across his chest and stripping him. The shirt revealed his chest, but without moving, he couldn't take the whole thing off. And though he was an alpha, he liked Mel on top of him. Mel broke the kiss and Luke tried to follow, but his ribs protested the sudden jerk. Mel wasn't stopping. She kissed her way down, starting with his neck and nipping at his jumping pulse. Luke's cock twitched. Just from a little play and he was near the edge. His thief was going to break him. He couldn't wait. Mel took her time exploring his chest. She took each of his nipples into her mouth, licking him until he moaned, calling out her name. She smiled up at him, but kept moving down, her hands finally landing on the button of his trousers. She undid them carefully, exposing him to the warm air of the room. Luke held himself absolutely still. He was nearly naked below her and desperate for her touch, but he felt like speaking would ruin this moment between them, break the magic and make them return to whatever their existence was before. Separate, alone. Mel could sense his desire, his need. She didn't take the length of him in her mouth or even kiss the tip. She kissed his thighs, reverently moving her hands up and around, feeling every inch of him. Every inch but the ones directly in front of her. And then, pure bliss. Luke closed his eyes, choking on another moan as she let her lips engulf his thick length. She worked him slowly, making him her slave with every stroke of her tongue. And Luke was glad of it. He bucked against her, completely spellbound and rapt with pleasure. Nothing could ruin this moment nor prevent their joining. His phone rang. Luke didn't immediately hear it, so caught up in his delicious thief, but the incessant ringing cut through and Mel pulled back. "It's yours," she said, reaching into his pants pocket and handing him his phone. If not for the heat in her eyes and his own desire, Luke wouldn't have known she'd had his cock in her mouth a second ago. But they weren't people who could afford to become wrapped up, especially not hours fresh from committing a theft in a foreign country. Luke looked at the caller ID and answered.
"Hello, Maya."
He hoped he didn't sound as frustrated as he felt. Mel crawled off of him and straightened her shirt. Luke wanted to pull her back down, to sit with her while he sorted whatever mess Maya had to clear up, but Mel was already walking away, and he couldn't afford to neglect his duties, no matter how much he wanted to. Mel slept through the night with a clean conscience, even if her dreams were anything but. She didn't regret what she'd done with the Alpha, but it had been a mistake. Not to be repeated. She thought that she'd learned her lesson when it came to mixing work and pleasure, but where Luke Torres was concerned, all bets were off. He set off something inside her that she hadn't known existed, and it wasn't just about lust. Lust she could handle. Impulse she could handle. He made her want, made her need something that she couldn't ever remember having, and that made him far more dangerous than any small-time fling.
She wasn't going to destroy herself again. Not over a man. On the bright side, whatever passed between them seemed to clear up the animosity he'd exuded on their flight down. They ate a pleasant breakfast of fruit and coffee and set off for the airstrip just after dawn. Luke told her that Maya had things under control. Cassie wasn't better, but she wasn't any worse either. Krista had spent most of her time closeted away with Cassie when she wasn't busy driving the second-in-command up the wall. In Maya's words, the witch was difficult. Luke laughed when he gave Mel the report. Mel wasn't surprised when she saw a familiar face at the airport. She stepped out of the car to see Bob standing in the bright light, a ridiculously floppy hat shielding his eyes from the bright sun. It wasn't yet hot, but the day was getting there. Luke was out of the car in a flash, standing just a foot in front of her, but only one small jump away. Mel stepped up and placed a calming hand on his arm. It shouldn't have worked. No matter what happened the night before, they had no real relationship, but she could feel the muscles in the Alpha's arm relax. He took half a step back, standing equal with her. That freaked her out even more. Luke was silently telling Bob that she was his equal, and that meant more than any words or actions they could exchange.
"It's a beautiful morning, isn't it?"
Bob asked, calling across the short distance between them. "I suppose," she replied. "What are you doing here?"
"Needed a ride out of town. Figured you had something set up already. I'll pay my portion of the bribes."
He held up a thick envelope.
"Courtesy of a certain mutual friend."
He tossed the envelope to Mel. She glanced inside. At a glance, there was at least $5,000 in there. Mel looked at Luke. "You're my client. It's your call." Bob's smart and he might have some insight into the current situation. Luke studied the other man. He grabbed Mel's hand and gave it a quick squeeze before letting go.
"If you trust him."
"There's one more thing you should know." Mel didn't know what possessed her to come clean, but even lying by omission felt wrong. Bob was the third man. Krista, me, and him lifted the Scarlet Emerald. She didn't know what reaction she expected. Luke looked over at Bob and studied him for another moment.
"They were in EC's with you. The diner in town."
If anything, humor laced his words. As good a reaction as she could hope for.
"Do you plan to tell your new mate about any other jobs I've worked?"
Bob asked. Mel felt everything still inside of her, and she could feel Luke coil up right beside her. Mate. It rang through her ears, bouncing around her head and completely taking her over. Was that what was between them? Mating was one of those funny shapeshifter quirks. Even if they shifted into animals that didn't form any lifetime bonds, shapeshifters sometimes found just the right person and stayed by them forever. Not always. It wasn't even that common, but it wasn't unheard of by a long shot. Most packs had at least one mated pair. Bob must have meant to be glib, to taunt her into a reaction. But if Luke was her mate, that made everything even worse. She couldn't stay in one place for long. And as alpha of a pack, Luke couldn't leave. They weren't mates. They couldn't be. She recovered before the alpha, off-kilter only for a matter of seconds. Enough for Bob to notice, but not enough for him to comment. "Shut the fuck up, dude. If you want a seat, it's yours." She grabbed her bag and walked into the hangar. Their plane was a small chartered machine. It could comfortably fit 8 people in huge seats, and it included a work area with picnic seating, with 2 chairs on each side of a table. They all sat there, Mel next to Bob. She wanted to sit next to the Alpha so much that she forced herself not to. In a short time, they would part ways, probably never see each other again. She had to get used to it now. She laid out the situation with Cassie, leaving the girl's relationship to Luke out of it. All Bob needed to know was that she was a member of Luke's pack. Here's the main problem. Luke has never tangled with witches before, and he doesn't know of any reason why they would target him now. So why the hex? They haven't said what they want. They haven't said who they are. Krista is probably working to trace it, but that's iffy at best. Mel set her hands on the table, her fingers twined together. You know what I think, but it's probably not her. Luke's gaze pierced Mel.
"Who do you think it is? Why didn't you tell me anything?"
Mel shouldn't have said anything, and she didn't want to explain in great detail. A witch killed my parents. She's very powerful and ambitious. But there's no reason to think she's involved in this. I'm not going to be some old Roman ranting against Carthage when it's clearly not. Bob grinned at talk of the classics.
"Ava hasn't made any moves in Colorado. Doesn't mean she won't. But last I heard she was in New England. Is there some sort of supernatural Facebook that I don't know about? Luke asked. I could name maybe 3 witches off the top of my head and half a dozen vampires. How do you know everyone?
He threw his hands up and let them land on the table. Mel reached over and grabbed onto them with a smile. We know who we need to know. But it's not called the underworld for nothing. I bet you know shapeshifters better than I do.
Don't patronize me.
Despite his tone, he smiled.
Do you want my help? Bob asked. I may have some avenues of inquiry that Krista can't access. Yes, said Luke. If Mel trusts you, I want you on the case.
Chapter 10. Krista gave Bob a big hug when they arrived back at Luke's house. While they'd thrown a dozen ideas back and forth over the course of the flight, nothing had stuck. Mel was ready to tear her hair out in frustration, but every time she reached the edge, Luke was there, saying the right thing, offering a small touch, making things better. But he wasn't her mate. She didn't have a mate, didn't need one, especially not him. Maya came down the stairs and took a look at Krista and Bob. We can't waste time. She turned to Mel. Did you get your magic powder? Something bitter tinged her words. Other than stealing from right under her nose, Mel hadn't wronged the second-in-command, but in just 2 days her demeanor had soured towards Mel. The lion's glance shifted to where Krista let Bob go. Perhaps it wasn't Mel then. Interesting. Mel tossed the powder at Krista. She caught it. Give me an hour. Bob can try his mojo while I get this ready. Maya led Krista to the kitchen, and Mel and Luke led Bob upstairs. Cassie smiled when she saw her brother. They'd taken away her bindings, and she had a book sitting on the bedside table. Luke! She smiled, her face glowing. Give me a hug! She held out her arms. Mel could see that the girl had lost weight since the beginning of this ordeal. After only a few days, her cheeks were hollow, her skin far paler than it should have been. Luke explained who Bob was and what he would try to do. With Cassie's permission, they let the other man take the seat beside her bed and stepped back to let him try to work. Without preamble, Luke grabbed Mel's hand and held it tight. Mel didn't have the heart, or the desire, to let him go. She was in so much trouble. Krista came upstairs a little more than an hour later. Bob stepped back to let the witch take his place.
I've taken a psychic imprint of Cassie,
he told Luke and Mel. He didn't comment on their linked hands.
If Krista is unable to find whoever did this to her, I'll do my best.
Luke nodded.
You have my thanks.
He turned to Mel.
I guess we could always go meet them like they want. The vampire hasn't given up anything.
Mel narrowed her eyes. You never said anything about a vampire.
Because it might have nothing to do with Cassie. And he isn't talking. It was one of the guys with you that night.
Krista looked over at them. She, Bob, and Mel all knew that Krista's mother, Tina, didn't have enough power to place a hex that powerful. But that was another connection to Ava and to the Scarlet Emerald. All 3 of them kept silent. They would know soon enough. We didn't know that they would be there until they showed up, said Mel. I don't know who they were. Luke accepted that, and a part of Mel felt horrible for not telling him all, but she had been who she was for much longer than she'd known him. She wasn't going to change overnight. She wasn't going to change at all. I'll need to be alone with Cassie, said Krista. I'll need to ward the room and can't have you in here distracting me. I'll set the ward so that Mel can break it if anything goes wrong.
Wrong how?
Luke took his hand from Mel's.
You didn't say anything about things going wrong.
Magic always has risk, Krista explained. But with Marco's powder, we should be more than adequately prepared for any funny business. Luke nodded. Krista produced a needle and pricked Mel's finger, collecting a speck of blood on a napkin. It will only take a few minutes. If I'm not out of here in half an hour, break the ward and check on me. Mel nodded. She and the other 2 men exited the room, leaving Krista alone with the Alpha's sister. Mel set her clock to time 30 minutes. Maya joined the 3 of them in the hallway. She gave the Alpha a hug. It will be okay. And it only helped to solidify Mel's belief that Mel wasn't Luke's mate. She wasn't jealous when another woman touched her man.
And didn't that mean that he wasn't hers at all?
Even she didn't buy that lie.
Luke hugged Maya back, but he couldn't stop himself from glancing at Mel. Bob's glib accusation had been flashing through his mind for hours. Mate. Mel was his mate. Of course, it made complete sense in a strange way. From the moment he'd first seen her, she hadn't been far from his thoughts. And he couldn't keep his hands off of her. She seemed likewise afflicted, but her eyes didn't narrow when he hugged Maya. He sensed no aggression from his thief. That was good. It meant that she already knew that he was hers, sensed it in her bones. At least he hoped that's what it meant. The alternative was not something he wanted to contemplate. He'd deal with it either way later. He had to make sure Cassie was safe first. Once the hex was lifted, he was sending her home and telling their parents what had happened. He couldn't hope to keep it from them. Just a few more minutes and the nightmare would be over. A scream rent the air and Luke's heart tore in his chest. He bolted for the door, stopped only by Mel and Maya holding him back. "Wait," said Mel. "It hasn't even been 5 minutes yet." He didn't want to wait. The lion inside of him roared to burst through the door and save his sister, except the ward on the other end would prevent him from even entering the room. After a second, both Mel and Maya took their hands off of him. Another scream, this one filled with pain. Luke looked at Mel.
"That doesn't sound right. You know it doesn't."
A roar. A leonine scream came through the wall. Mel had her hand on the door before he could react. She placed her hand on the thickened air, opening a gash in one palm with one of her claws. The air rippled, a shockwave knocking him back a step. Luke pushed past Mel and took in the scene. Krista had been knocked to the floor, all of her supplies scattered on the floorboards. The witch had an ugly, bloody gash across her collarbone. She held a hand to it and tried to crawl away from the monster on the bed. But Cassie had her claws out, digging into the witch's back as she tried to move. His sister was in the throes of her first shift, brought on by the trauma of the hex and from trying to remove it. The shift couldn't be stopped, and if they didn't act quickly, Krista was going to die. A shapeshifter's first change was a thing of madness. The animal took over, hungry for blood, for the hunt, and once blood had been spilled, they were wild until they sated their hunger or shifted back. Her hands had transformed into gigantic claws, and her mouth and nose elongated to form the beginnings of a snout. But the rest of her was still human. Maya was already moving, approaching the witch and trying to get her out of the way. Luke couldn't see Mel, but he had to trust that she was trying to help. He approached his sister and put steel in his voice, speaking as her brother wouldn't get through to her, but being an alpha might. He roared, letting the sound fill the room. It didn't sound right coming from his human throat, but it gave Cassie pause. She tilted her head towards him. Her eyes were turning to a yellowish brown. More and more of her was shifting. He needed her to shift all the way. He could try to control her then. Maybe talk sense into her.
"Let it happen, Cass," he said. "You need to relax into it."
But she didn't understand. Only pain and hunger lived in her eyes. She swung her claws at him, growling wildly and missing by several feet. Luke jerked back anyway. Cassie wasn't this violent thing, and he wasn't going to help her by playing nice. Maya got Krista completely out of the way, giving him more room to maneuver. Mel was still absent. The next time Cassie swung at him, he grabbed her arm, pulling her to the floor and straddling her legs. He had full control over her in this position, but Cassie had anger. She kept scratching, making little nicks in his flesh. They stung, but Luke could handle the pain. He just had to hold her there long enough for the shift to take over, but Cassie didn't want to be held. She bucked at him, the sudden motion jerking him forward. With a swiftness he didn't know she possessed, she rolled out from under him onto her feet and ran for the door, where the bleeding woman was propped against the wall of the hallway. Luke grabbed for his sister, pulling her back down. He tried to hold her again, but he couldn't do much without hurting her. Even knowing that she couldn't feel any blows on top of the pain she was already experiencing, even knowing that he wouldn't cause any permanent damage, he couldn't hit her. She was his baby sister, and she wasn't doing this on purpose. Cassie had no such compunctions.
She swiped at him again, this time getting in a lucky shot and opening up several inches of flesh on his arm. The only positive from that was that she was now focused solely on him, no longer diving for the wounded Krista. Fur covered his sister's arms now, though the bones beneath hadn't completely shifted. He needed to get her farther into it, no matter how much she didn't want to cooperate. But he hesitated, and Cassie took another swipe, this time making him stumble back to stop from hitting her or slamming her to the ground. A black mass barreled into him, Mel in her leopard form. She spared a second to bare her teeth at him, growling, and Luke understood. He couldn't stop Cassie. He wasn't willing to hurt her. Mel could, if he trusted her. He scooted back, letting the leopard thief take over. She wasted no time, pouncing directly on his sister and letting her claws prick at the human skin. Fur bloomed on Cassie wherever she was hurt, her body healing itself into the form it wanted to shift into. Mel got on top of the girl and planted her teeth within her. But she was gentle, making sure that whatever injury she caused wouldn't last beyond the shift. Luke scented his mate's blood and had to hold himself back. This wasn't a fight he could win. And nearly as soon as it began, it was done. Cassie's body gave a final ripple, and a lioness stood where once there had been a girl. "Alpha, down!" yelled Krista. Luke ducked, rolling out of the way without seeing the threat. Something whizzed through the air over his head, landing in the golden fur of the lioness. Cassie took 2 steps on her new paws before crashing to the side, the sedative knocking her out. Luke looked over at the witch. Maya had a rag pressed gently against her biggest wound. Krista held a huge tranquilizer gun against her shoulder. She slowly lowered it. She tried to speak, but coughed before any words came out. After a moment, she tried again. "I couldn't lift the hex. Something triggered her shift before I could do anything, and the anti-hex powder is gone." Luke looked away. He couldn't deal with that yet. He padded over to his sister and plucked the dart out of her side. She breathed evenly, probably sleeping better than she had in weeks. He laid a hand on her head and sat next to her. Mel snuck up beside him and lay down, still in her leopard form. She rested her head on his thigh. Luke used his other hand to pet her head. It was an intimate gesture, something he would never have felt right doing to someone he didn't know. But Mel was different. He closed his eyes, allowing himself 3 seconds to wallow in defeat. Sitting on the ground, even with his mate by his side, he didn't know how anything could ever get better. Cassie was still hexed. Mel would probably try to leave the second she got the chance, and he had no idea what enemy he faced. But those seconds passed and he opened his eyes. He couldn't afford any more than 3 seconds. His enemy wanted to meet. Bring it on.